Before the sun rises over the Nile, before the fields begin to glow gold under the first light, and before the voices of workers slowly drift across the riverbanks, there is a quiet moment that belongs only to the water. A very old quiet. A stillness that has lived there for thousands of years. The Nile rests in the darkness like a ribbon of shadow stretching far into the sleeping land. The surface barely moves. Only the faintest ripple touches the reeds near the banks. The stars above remain soft and pale, and their reflections tremble gently in the dark water. The air feels cool before dawn. Cool enough that the stone walls of village homes still hold traces of the night. The earth feels damp beneath bare feet. And somewhere along the eastern bank, inside a small mud brick house with a flat roof and low doorway, a man wakes before anyone else. He opens his eyes slowly. For a moment he lies still under a woven linen cloth while the darkness remains around him. Beside him, his family is asleep. Quiet breathing. Soft movement. A child turning gently on a reed mat. Outside, the world waits. He sits up carefully. His feet touch the packed earth floor. The room smells faintly of clay and dry straw and the ashes of last night's cooking fire. A pottery jar rests near the wall. A basket hangs from a wooden peg. A folded linen tunic waits nearby. He reaches for it. The cloth feels cool in his hands. He dresses in silence. Then he bends near the doorway and steps outside. The sky is changing now. Not bright. Only lighter than before. A long pale glow stretches above the eastern horizon. Palm trees appear as dark shapes. Date branches move gently in the breeze. Farther away the Nile reflects that faint color and begins to shine. The village is still asleep. But not for long. Soon many doors will open. Soon sandals will touch the paths between houses. Soon baskets will be lifted and ropes tied and boats loosened from wooden stakes. Soon another day beside the Nile will begin. The man walks slowly toward the riverbank. His name does not matter now. History has forgotten his name. But thousands like him woke exactly the same way. Morning after morning. Year after year. Century after century. They rose before sunrise because the river shaped everything. The Nile decided the rhythm of life. It gave water. It gave food. It gave rich black soil. It decided when land could be planted. It decided when boats could move easily. It decided when villages grew strong. And so every day began with the river. Even now, before dawn, the bank is beginning to stir. A fisherman crouches beside a small wooden boat. He runs rough fingers along a net, checking every knot. A teenage boy carries coiled rope over one shoulder. An older woman kneels near the edge of the water filling clay jars while the river laps quietly against stone. A farmer arrives with a hoe balanced across his back. Another carries woven baskets. They move without hurry. No one rushes. The day is long. The work is familiar. And everything begins gently. The fisherman pushes his boat forward. The wet wood slides softly into the water. The river accepts it. He steps inside and steadies himself. His son climbs in behind him. They untie the rope and drift a little from shore. No splash. Only movement. The oar dips once. Twice. The boat glides outward through silver-gray water. Nearby birds begin waking among papyrus reeds. A low rustle. A flutter of wings. Then stillness again. The sky grows brighter. More homes open. More footsteps. The smell of fresh bread begins drifting through the village. Inside one house a woman kneels beside a clay oven. The fire glows low and orange. She presses dough between practiced hands. The grain was ground the evening before. The flour is coarse and warm-smelling. She shapes round flat loaves and places them carefully on heated stone. Her youngest daughter watches sleepily. A son rubs his eyes and yawns. Soon they too will begin chores. There is always work. Sweeping. Grinding. Carrying water. Cleaning tools. Feeding goats. Repairing baskets. Preparing meals. Every person in the village belongs to the rhythm. Even children. Especially children. They learn early. They learn by watching. By carrying small things. By following older hands. By walking the same dusty paths each day. Outside, dawn arrives more clearly. The eastern sky softens into pale gold. The Nile reflects it like polished bronze. The water brightens. Fields beyond the village become visible. Long strips of land stretch outward, rich and dark. The floodwaters months ago left behind thick black earth. Now young crops stand in rows. Barley. Emmer wheat. Flax. Green and growing quietly. A farmer steps into the field. Bare feet sink lightly into damp soil. He bends low. Touches the earth. Feels moisture beneath his fingers. Checks the plants. He has done this thousands of mornings. The same careful movement. The same slow walk. The same quiet measuring of river and soil and sky. He looks toward irrigation canals. Narrow channels branch from the river. The water moves gently through them. Small gates made from mud and reeds guide flow toward fields. A younger man adjusts one with a wooden pole. Water shifts direction. A shallow current spreads over thirsty ground. The sound is soft. Almost like whispering. The Nile reaches the crops. And the crops begin another day. Farther downstream a larger boat prepares near a dock. Workers load baskets. Fish. Clay jars. Bundles of flax. Dates packed carefully in woven trays. The boatman checks the sail. Morning wind begins moving lightly from the north. That helps. The river carries trade as naturally as it carries water. Villages connect through boats. Cities receive grain. Temples receive supplies. Stone travels. Papyrus rolls travel. Messages travel. Life moves up and down the Nile every day. Always moving. Always returning. A temple in the distance catches first sunlight. Its stone walls glow faint gold. Tall columns rise against the brightening sky. Priests there have already awakened. Inside cool shadowed halls, sandals touch stone floors. Oil lamps flicker. Water is poured into polished basins. Incense waits. Prayers begin before full sunrise. The day belongs to workers and farmers and fishermen. But it also belongs to ritual. Ancient Egypt breathes through both. Hands working. Voices praying. River flowing. Sun rising. Together. Always together. The village becomes warmer. A donkey brays softly. Goats gather near a fence. Children carry baskets to storage jars. Women spread linen to dry. A potter begins turning clay. His hands wet the surface. The wheel moves. Slow and steady. A vessel rises. Smooth sides. Perfect curve. Morning light touches the clay. Nearby a carpenter sharpens tools. Bronze glints briefly. Wood shavings gather near his feet. Everything feels calm. Every task familiar. every movement repeated through generations. The Nile keeps flowing. The sun climbs a little higher. And now the color deepens. Gold across the water. Warmth on stone. Palm leaves shining green. The riverbank bright and alive. A group of workers heads north carrying baskets suspended from shoulder poles. Their pace is even. Sandals pressing earth. Bodies swaying gently with each step. No one speaks loudly. Only quiet conversation. A nod. A small laugh. The easy language of people beginning work together. They pass painted walls. Granaries. Courtyards. Cats resting in shade. Then the path curves beside reeds. And the Nile opens wide before them. Beautiful. Ancient. Steady. A mirror of light. A source of life. And as the sun rises fully above the eastern horizon, the river brightens in a long shining band stretching farther than the eye can follow. Morning has arrived. The cool air begins warming. The fields wake. The boats move farther. The fishermen cast their first nets. The temple doors open wider. The ovens bake fresh bread. The farmers bend over dark soil. And another day begins along the Nile exactly as many thousands began before it. Slowly. Quietly. With water and earth and gentle sunlight. And with the feeling that this river has always been here. And always will be. The fishermen drift farther now, deeper into shining water. Their small wooden boat rocks gently. The father studies the surface. The son holds the edge of the net. Both remain quiet. Listening. Watching. The river seems peaceful. But they know its moods. They know hidden currents. They know where fish gather. Where reeds bend. Where shadows underwater move. The father lifts one hand. A signal. The net swings out. For one beautiful second it spreads wide through sunlight like woven silver. Then disappears beneath the surface. The ripples widen. And the boat drifts slowly onward. The ripples spread outward from the boat in slow circles. They move across the brightening Nile, touching reeds near the shoreline and slipping gently past floating leaves before fading into smooth water again. For a few moments the fisherman and his son wait. Neither speaks. The father keeps one hand lightly against the wooden edge of the boat. The son watches the surface carefully. A bird glides low across the river. Its wings almost touch the water. Then it rises again toward the far bank where papyrus reeds sway in the soft morning breeze. The sun has climbed just enough now to warm their shoulders. Night is disappearing. The silver light of dawn has become pale gold. The world feels wider. Brighter. Still calm. Still gentle. But fully awake. The father pulls the net. Slowly at first. The rope tightens. Water drips from the woven cords. The son leans in and helps. Together they lift. The net rises shining in sunlight. A few fish flash silver and dark gray between the knots. Their bodies twist. Water splashes lightly against the boat. The father nods. A quiet, satisfied nod. Not a large catch. But enough. Enough for breakfast. Enough to trade. Enough to continue. The son smiles softly and reaches into the net. His hands move carefully. He has learned from years of watching. From standing in boats like this before sunrise. From listening to his father explain currents and depth and patience. Fishing on the Nile is rarely rushed. The river gives when it chooses. And so the hands working upon it move with calm. A little farther south another boat glides into view. Then another. Small wooden fishing boats spaced across the river, each moving with its own quiet rhythm. Oars dipping, nets lifting, voices low and gentle. The river feels busy now, but never loud, never crowded. Even with many workers, there is space. Long stretches of open shining water. A breeze carrying the scent of wet earth. The sound of birds among reeds. And sunlight growing warmer minute by minute. Back near the village, breakfast has begun. Families gather in shaded courtyards. Flat loaves still warm from clay ovens. Fresh dates. Figs. A little onion. A jar of cool water lifted from the river earlier. Children sit cross-legged on woven mats. Still sleepy. Still rubbing their eyes. A grandmother tears bread and places pieces into small waiting hands. Nearby a goat nudges against a clay wall. A cat stretches in sunlight. The morning feels peaceful. Familiar. Safe. The kind of morning repeated so many times it feels like part of the earth itself. After eating, people rise and continue. A young girl carries an empty jar toward the Nile. Her sandals leave small prints in dusty ground. She walks carefully down the familiar path between homes. Past baskets hanging from wooden poles. Past neighbors sweeping doorways. Past the potter's workshop where clay bowls line the wall drying in the sun. The river waits at the end of the path. Bright now. Beautiful. She kneels near the edge. The jar tips. Water fills with a soft hollow sound. Cool and clear. She lifts carefully. The weight presses into her arms. But she knows how to carry it. One step. Then another. Back toward home. Back through morning light. Every task matters. Even the smallest. A jar of water. A repaired basket. A sharpened hoe. A net checked before sunrise. Everything joins together. And because of that, the village moves smoothly. Quietly. Like river water flowing around stone. Farther inland, farmers are already deep in their work. The fields stretch dark and rich under the rising sun. Rows of grain shine green. A canal guides water through narrow channels. One farmer kneels and presses wet mud against a small opening. The water changes direction. Another clears weeds. Another lifts a basket filled with cut reeds. A team works beside a wooden shad. The long balancing pole rises and dips. Rises and dips. A bucket lowers into water. Then lifts. Then pours into the irrigation trench. Again. And again. The motion is steady. Almost peaceful to watch. The pole creaks softly. Water spills. The trench fills. The field drinks. The Nile reaches farther inland through human hands. A man pauses and straightens his back. He wipes sweat from his forehead. The morning is warming now. The cool air fading. Sunlight touches his shoulders. But still the breeze from the river moves across the fields. Still pleasant. Still soft. He looks toward the horizon. Palm trees. Mud brick homes. A distant temple wall glowing in the sun. And beyond all of it the river. Always there. Always moving. The Nile never disappears from thought. Even when not visible. Its presence stays. In every crop. Every loaf of bread. Every basket of fish. Every jar filled with drinking water. The river touches everything. At the temple the day has grown busier. Workers sweep stone walkways. Priests move through cool halls carrying water and linen. Incense rises slowly. Thin lines of smoke drifting upward into morning light. Columns cast long shadows. Stone floors remain cool beneath sandals. A young temple servant arranges offerings. Bread. Fruit. Fresh flowers. Simple things. Placed with care. Placed with steady hands. Outside the temple gate a delivery boat has arrived. Large clay jars are unloaded carefully. Workers pass them hand to hand. Each step practiced. No wasted movement. No hurry. Only rhythm. A rhythm shaped by repetition. A rhythm learned over years. The same rhythm as fields. As fishing nets. As ovens warming bread. Everything feels connected. And now the sun climbs higher. The river becomes brighter. Its surface sparkles. Tiny flashes of light dancing with movement. A boat carrying flax passes downstream. Bundles stacked carefully. A boy near the bow watches birds circling overhead. The sail catches wind. The fabric lifts and fills. The boat glides smoothly. The current helping. Northward breeze helping too. The Nile carrying trade exactly as it has for centuries. At the edge of the village a carpenter works beneath shade. A wooden stool. Bronze blade. Smooth cedar. His hands carve slowly. A tool handle today. Tomorrow perhaps part of a chest. Or a fishing oar. Or a support beam for a doorway. Wood is valuable. Every piece matters. He works carefully. Thin curls fall to the ground. Sunlight touches them. Golden and bright. Nearby another artisan twists flax fibers into rope. Strong rope. Useful for boats. For baskets. For carrying goods. His fingers move quickly. Practiced. Almost without thought. Morning work everywhere. Large tasks. Small tasks. Heavy work. Gentle work. Each one part of the whole. Children move through it all. Watching. Learning. Helping. A little boy follows his older brother to the grain store. The storage building stays cool inside. Mud brick walls thick and shaded. Large baskets line the interior. Grain fills them nearly to the top. Golden and dry. The smell is warm. Earthy. Comforting. Hands scoop and measure. A basket lifted. A lid secured. Account remembered. Outside sunlight grows stronger. The shadows shorten. Birdsong rises from the reeds. The fisherman and his son return toward shore. The boat heavier now. Fish resting inside woven trays. Water dripping from the hull. Their oars move slowly. No hurry. They have done well. Enough for the household. Enough for market. Enough to continue tomorrow. As they near the bank, other boats arrive too. A quiet gathering. Wood touching shore. Ropes tied. Feet stepping into damp mud. The sun lifts a tray. The fish glimmer. Neighbors greet each other with small smiles. A few words. Morning conversation. Gentle and easy. A woman waits with baskets. Fresh catch will be cleaned soon. Then traded. Then cooked. Then eaten before the heat of afternoon arrives. Life moves beautifully through simple steps. One task becoming another. River to net. Net to basket. Basket to home. Home to meal. Meal to strength. Strength back to work. The Nile keeps everything turning. And still the river shines, bright under the growing sun, wide and calm and ancient. Papyrus rustles softly. A breeze lifts loose linen cloth. Water taps against stone. Far away a heron stands motionless in shallow water. Watching. Waiting. The sky above has turned clear blue. The last traces of dawn gone now. Morning fully open. Warm and golden. The village alive. Fields busy. Boats moving. Hands working. Children learning. Temples quiet and cool. And over all of it the Nile stretches endlessly. A silver blue ribbon carrying sunlight and memory through the land. Another group of workers begins walking south along the riverbank. They carry woven baskets and wooden poles. Their pace even. Measured. Sandals brushing against dry ground. The path curves gently beside tall reeds. Beyond the bend, hidden for now behind bright green papyrus and palms, another stretch of shoreline waits. And there, already catching sunlight, another day of work has begun beside the water. Beyond the bend in the river, where the papyrus grew thick and green along the water's edge, another shoreline had already awakened. The sunlight reached there first. Golden and warm. It touched the tops of reeds and spread slowly across the bank, brightening wet stones and narrow footpaths pressed into the earth by countless passing feet. A group of women stood near the water with clay jars resting beside them. Some were filling them. Some were washing vegetables gathered before sunrise. Others paused to speak quietly while their hands kept moving. A gentle conversation. Soft voices. Simple morning words. The jars dipped into the Nile and lifted again. Water shining inside. Cool and fresh. The river lapped softly against the shore. A little farther back from the bank, a boy no older than 10 guided 2 donkeys along a narrow dirt path. Their baskets were loaded with bundles of flax. The animals moved slowly. Comfortably. They knew the path well. Dust rose lightly beneath their hooves. The boy walked beside them barefoot, one hand resting on a rope, his eyes half on the ground and half on the river beside him. The Nile stayed close. Always close. Its brightness followed him as he walked. Even in silence it felt alive. Not demanding attention. Not rushing. Just moving. Steady and patient. Farther ahead, the path widened into a small riverside landing. Several wooden boats were tied there. Some long and narrow. Others wider and built to carry heavier goods. A pair of workers lifted clay jars from shore to deck. Another rolled tightly woven rope and placed it beneath shade. The boatman checked the mast. His hands touched each knot. Each wooden beam. Each folded sail. Nothing hurried. Every movement thoughtful. The river rewarded patience. A sudden mistake could waste a day. A forgotten rope. A damaged paddle. A cracked jar. So every detail mattered. A young apprentice stood nearby watching. He was learning. Watching older hands. Listening to small instructions. Feeling the grain of wood. Memorizing knots. Learning where to place his feet when a boat rocked gently under shifting weight. These lessons came slowly. No long speeches. No formal teaching. Only repetition. Observation. Time. The kind of learning carried quietly from one generation to the next. Behind the landing, mud brick homes rested beneath palms. Flat rooftops. Low walls. Doorways open to morning air. A woman spread linen cloth over a rooftop ledge. The sunlight caught the pale fabric. It fluttered gently. Below her, inside the shaded courtyard, another woman ground grain on a stone slab. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. A slow steady rhythm. The grain became flour little by little. The smell was dry and warm. Comforting. A toddler sat nearby with a wooden toy carved in the shape of a bird. He dragged it across the ground and watched the shadow move with it. Somewhere behind the homes a goat bleated. A rooster answered. Then quiet returned. A peaceful village sound. Nothing sharp. Nothing sudden. Just the gentle movement of another Nile morning unfolding. Out on the water, fishermen drifted farther south. Their boats spread wide across the shining surface. A net dropped. An oar dipped. A bird skimmed low. The river reflected everything. The sky. The sails. The palms. The slow passing of time. Near a shallow bank, one older fisherman stood still in his boat. He looked toward a familiar patch of reeds. He had fished there for years. Maybe decades. He knew the shape of the shoreline. The changing depth. Where fish gathered after the flooding season. Where currents curved gently around hidden stones. He lowered his net without a sound. Then waited. His body balanced perfectly with the movement of the boat. The river held him. The breeze touched his shoulders. The sun warmed his face. And time seemed to move almost as slowly as the current. On the western bank, farmers were already bending low in the fields. Their shadows stretched long behind them. The soil remained dark and rich. Moist from irrigation. A farmer stepped carefully along a narrow ridge between planted rows. His basket rested against his hip. He paused to inspect a young crop. Touched a leaf. Pressed the soil. Then continued. A few rows over, another farmer worked beside a shed of. The long wooden beam dipped. Lifted. Poured. Again. And again. The bucket emptied water into the trench. The trench carried it farther. Toward waiting plants. Toward thirsty earth. A child stood nearby watching closely. One day the pole would be his responsibility. For now he only observed. Hands resting against the wooden support. Eyes following each motion. The farmer smiled without speaking. Then lowered the bucket again. The morning deepened. The sun rose higher. Light spread wider over the land. The coolness from dawn remained in the shade. But warmth gathered across rooftops and stone paths. Palm leaves shone bright green. The Nile sparkled silver blue. And from the distance came another boat. Longer than the fishing boats. Heavier. Its sail stretched wide. Workers stood aboard beside stacks of cargo. Papyrus bundles. Clay jars sealed with woven covers. Baskets of dried dates. Wooden tools. Supplies moving north along the river. The sail caught the wind. The boat glided quietly. Smooth and effortless. As if the Nile itself carried it. At the bow stood the captain. One hand resting against polished wood. Eyes watching the current. Watching other boats. Watching the shoreline. He knew the river well. He knew where the water narrowed. Where hidden sand banks appeared. Where wind changed direction. Travel along the Nile required attention. But attention had become second nature. Like breathing. Like walking. Like rising before dawn. Near midday another village would receive those supplies. Another shoreline. Another landing. Another set of waiting hands. The Nile joined them all. A moving road of water. Always busy. Always calm. Always essential. Back in the first village, the morning market had begun. A shaded space near the central path. Simple and orderly. Woven baskets arranged on low mats. Fresh fish laid carefully. Dates stacked. Garlic and onions grouped together. Clay bowls. Small carved tools. Bundles of flax rope. Nothing grand. Nothing loud. People moved through quietly. Trading. Nodding. Choosing. A basket exchanged. A fish inspected. A few words spoken. Then more walking. The market smelled of fresh bread and warm earth. And somewhere nearby someone had cut open ripe figs. Sweetness drifted lightly through the air. Children passed through with quick steps. A woman balanced goods against her shoulder. An older man sat in shade repairing a basket handle. His fingers steady. His eyes relaxed. The day moved on. Smooth and familiar. At the temple, cool shadows remained. Stone columns blocked the growing brightness. Inside, the scent of incense lingered. A priest walked through a narrow corridor carrying fresh water. Sandals soft against polished stone. Another arranged flowers. A third stood quietly near a carved wall. Hands still. Eyes lowered. Outside the gate sunlight brightened the courtyard. But inside, time felt slower. Calmer. Like a pause within the wider rhythm of the day. Even temples followed the Nile's pattern. Morning preparation. Daily offerings. Work repeated with care. The same as fields. The same as fishing. The same as homes. Everything in motion. Everything connected. Near the river a group of children crouched beside the reeds. Watching tiny fish flicker in shallow water. One child touched the surface. Ripples spread. A bird lifted from nearby papyrus. Wings beating softly. The children smiled and then quieted again. Even their play felt peaceful here. The river taught calm. Taught patience. Taught watching. The Nile had done that for generations. Without words. Without force. Simply by being there. Always moving. Always returning. Always flowing between green banks and dark fertile land. Now the sun climbed higher still. The golden softness of early morning began shifting toward brighter white light. Shadows shortened. Workers wiped their brows. The breeze still came from the north. Cool enough to feel welcome. Boats kept moving. Oars dipping. Sails lifting. The fisherman from earlier walked through the village carrying his basket. His son followed behind. The fish glimmered in sunlight. Neighbors greeted them. A few words. A smile. A nod. Then the son turned toward home. But the father continued toward the riverside landing. Another boat had arrived. And on that boat stood a man carrying rolled papyrus and tied bundles from farther south. He stepped carefully onto shore. The wood creaked beneath his sandals. He lifted his head. Looked across the landing. And in the warm brightness of the growing Nile morning, as boats rocked gently against wooden posts and reeds whispered beside the shore, he began walking toward the village path with quiet purpose. The man from the boat walked slowly from the landing toward the village path. He carried 2 rolled bundles of papyrus tied with flax cord beneath one arm, and over his shoulder hung a woven bag darkened by travel and dust. His sandals were worn. The edges smooth from long journeys. The hem of his linen tunic brushed lightly against his ankles with each step. He did not hurry. Travel along the Nile had taught him patience. The river moved steadily. The boats moved steadily. And so the people who spent much of their lives between shorelines often learned that same rhythm. A quiet pace. Measured and calm. The landing behind him remained busy. Workers continued lifting baskets. A rope tightened around a wooden post. A clay jar passed from one pair of hands to another. The sail of the cargo boat shifted gently in the breeze. But the traveler kept walking. Ahead, the path curved beside tall reeds. Sunlight spilled through them in narrow bright strips. Birds moved between papyrus stalks. The Nile gleamed through green leaves and stems. Always visible. Always nearby. As he approached the village, familiar sounds reached him. Grinding grain. Low voices. The tap of wood against wood. A goat moving in shade. The distant creak of a shadove lifting water from canal to field. Morning work still filled every corner. He passed a mud brick wall warm in the sunlight. A child looked up from sweeping a doorway. Then smiled and returned to work. A woman balanced a clay jar against her hip and stepped aside to let him pass. She noticed the papyrus bundles. Likely messages. Likely records. Perhaps trade accounts. Temple notes. Instructions for supplies. The river carried many things. Not only grain and fish and flax. It carried words too. Written carefully by practiced hands. Messages traveling from village to village. Town to temple. Shore to shore. The traveler turned into a shaded courtyard near the center of the village. Palm leaves above him shifted with the breeze. Patterns of sunlight moved across the packed earth. A small table stood beneath shade. A seated man looked up from his work. He held a reed pen. Beside him sat a clay ink palette. And stacked carefully nearby were sheets of papyrus. The village scribe. His posture relaxed. His fingers stained dark from ink. His eyes thoughtful and steady. The traveler greeted him quietly. Set the bundles down. And both men exchanged a few calm words. Then silence. The scribe untied the cord. Rolled open one sheet. Looked over neat columns of writing. Symbols arranged with care. Records of grain deliveries. Measurements. Temple requests. Perhaps tax tallies from farther south. The sort of daily details that kept villages organized. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent. Just information. Small careful marks preserving the rhythm of ordinary life. The scribe dipped his pen. Copied notes onto a fresh sheet. The traveler waited. Palm leaves rustled overhead. A cat stretched in the shade. A jar of water rested cool beside the wall. Everything peaceful. Even writing felt gentle here. As natural as fishing or farming. Across the village, the morning continued unfolding. The marketplace remained active. Fresh bread now stacked higher. Clay bowls catching bright sunlight. A fisherman bartered part of his catch. A woman selected onions from a basket. Two neighbors paused to speak. Then moved on. A little farther away, beside the carpenter's shaded work area, thin curls of wood gathered around a low stool. The carpenter turned a handle in his hand. Examined it. Smoothed one edge with bronze. His movements were careful and exact. He knew every grain and knot. Wood was valuable. And the tool he shaped today would likely be used for years. A hoe handle perhaps. Or an oar. Or part of a loom. Things meant to last. Things touched every day. A small breeze moved through the workshop. Dry wood scent mixed with warm dust. Comforting. Familiar. Beyond the homes the fields shimmered softly under brightening sunlight. Farmers still worked in long rows. Bent low. Hands in dark soil. A few straightened and stretched. Then returned again. A canal carried water quietly. One narrow branch overflowed a little and soaked into thirsty ground. A farmer pressed mud against the edge. Guided the flow. Watched the water settle. Then nodded. A simple correction. A necessary one. So much depended on balance. Too much water. Too little. Both mattered. And every farmer learned the river's language through observation. Season after season. Flood after flood. Morning after morning. They knew how the earth changed beneath bare feet. How soil smelled after irrigation. How the crops looked under strong sun. Knowledge passed not through books, but through work. Hands teaching hands. Eyes teaching eyes. On the river another fishing boat drifted close to shore. A father and daughter this time. The daughter crouched near the edge. Hands deep in netting. Separating fish carefully. Silver scales flashed bright. Water dripped into the boat. The father guided with one oar. Slow steady strokes. Nearby a flock of birds lifted suddenly from the reeds. A burst of wings. Then quiet. The birds circled once and settled farther downriver. The daughter smiled. Then returned to work. Sunlight touched the water around them. Bright and clear. At the temple, midday preparations were beginning. Servants carried baskets through the courtyard. A priest walked through shadow holding fresh linen folded neatly over both arms. The stone beneath his sandals stayed cool. Even now. Even with the sun climbing high. Columns blocked the brightness and shaped long strips of shade across the walls. Incense drifted. Thin and pale. A quiet fragrance. A pause in the day. But not stillness. Never complete stillness. Always movement. Always work. Just slower. Gentler. Measured. Back near the riverside landing the cargo boat had nearly finished unloading. Workers wiped sweat from their brows. The sail loosened. Clay jars stacked neatly in shade. Bundles arranged for delivery. One man drank from a small cup and looked out over the river. The Nile glittered brilliantly now. Almost white in places where sunlight struck directly. The current moved south to north. Steady. Reliable. A smaller boat passed by carrying fresh-cut reeds. Its wake brushed lightly against the dock. Wood creaked. Rope tightened. Then quiet again. A young apprentice knelt near the edge repairing a worn strap. He threaded flax carefully. Pulled tight. Checked it twice. Then set it aside. Ready for use again. Everything was repaired. Reused. Maintained. A basket broken today would be woven again tomorrow. A cracked handle replaced. A net mended. A sail patched. Nothing wasted if it could still serve. The rhythm of Nile life depended on care. Patience. Steady hands. Time. And because of that, even ordinary objects seemed important. A rope. A jar. A basket. A hoe. Each one tied to the next task. And the next. And the next. The traveler remained with the scribe a little longer. More notes copied. More papyrus rolled and tied. Then the scribe handed back one finished bundle. The traveler placed it carefully into his bag. A brief nod between them. No long farewell. Just quiet understanding. Soon the traveler would continue north. Perhaps before afternoon. Perhaps after rest and water. The Nile waited. And the villages ahead waited too. Their own fields. Their own shorelines. Their own quiet work under the same sun. A child nearby laughed softly. A short happy sound. Then disappeared into the village path. A donkey stepped around a corner carrying baskets of grain. Dust lifted around its feet. Palm shadows moved. A potter turned wet clay between steady fingers. The wheel spun. The vessel rose. Smooth and round. A perfect curve forming beneath careful hands. The sunlight brightened the clay surface. Then drifted across the courtyard wall. The day continued. The heat deepened a little. But the breeze from the Nile still softened the air. Still carried coolness. Still moved reeds and palm leaves. Still touched rooftops and boats and fields. A gift from the river. Always present. Always welcome. And now from farther inland, just beyond the green fields and irrigation canals, a small group of workers appeared walking toward the shoreline. Each carried woven baskets suspended from wooden poles. Their steps even. Measured. Unhurried. They followed the narrow path between rows of crops. Toward the river. Toward the landing. Toward whatever waited to be loaded next beside the bright flowing Nile. The workers coming from the fields moved at an even pace. Their sandals pressed softly into the narrow path between rows of grain. The baskets balanced across their shoulders swayed gently with every step. No one rushed. The day had grown warmer now, but there was still enough breeze from the Nile to make walking comfortable. Palm leaves shifted overhead. Shadows moved slowly over the path. And the river ahead shone brightly through reeds and open stretches of green. Each worker carried something gathered from the morning. Fresh cut flax tied into bundles. Baskets filled with onions and garlic. A few carried tools that needed repair. Wooden handles worn smooth from long use. Bronze blades wrapped carefully in cloth. The village landing waited just ahead. From a distance they could already hear the quiet sounds. Wood touching wood. Water brushing the shore. A rope tightening. A low voice calling to another worker. The ordinary music of river life. The kind of sounds heard every day. So often they almost disappeared into the background. One of the men shifted the wooden pole on his shoulder and glanced toward the Nile. Sunlight shimmered across the surface. A boat moved north with its sail open. Farther downstream another drifted closer to shore while two fishermen checked a net. The river looked calm. Almost still. But beneath the brightness it kept moving. Always carrying. Always shaping. Always connecting one stretch of life to another. When the workers reached the landing they lowered their baskets carefully. A soft thud against packed earth. A little dust rising. Then stillness again. One by one they arranged the goods in neat rows. The flax near the dock. The produce closer to shade. The worn tools set aside for the carpenter. Every object had its place. Every task linked to the next. Nearby the cargo boat from earlier remained tied to shore. Its captain stood near the mast speaking quietly with another boatman. Both shaded their eyes against the brightness. Both watched the river as they talked. A shift in the wind. A change in the current. Small things mattered. The Nile was generous. But wise river people always paid attention. A little farther back under a palm tree, the traveler who had delivered papyrus earlier sat with a cup of cool water. His bag rested beside him. He leaned against the mud brick wall and closed his eyes for a few peaceful moments. The shade felt good. The long river journey could wait a little while. The breeze touched his face. The voices around him blended with birdsong and water. A restful pause. Not sleep. Just stillness. A moment held between journeys. Inside the village the marketplace had grown busier. The bright morning had pulled more people outside. Fresh loaves rested in baskets. Dates gleamed dark and sweet in the sun. A woman arranged garlic bulbs into careful rows. A fisherman laid out his remaining catch. The silver scales reflected light like polished stone. Neighbors greeted each other softly. A few exchanged goods. Others simply passed through. No loud bargaining. No sharp voices. Only calm conversation. The kind repeated every day. A rhythm as familiar as footsteps on the village path. Children moved between adults. One carrying a small basket. Another balancing a clay cup with both hands. A little boy paused to stare at a fish laid out for trade. Its scales flashed bright blue-gray. He crouched lower. Studied it. Then looked up as his mother gently called him onward. He smiled and followed. Not far away, the potter's wheel continued turning. Wet clay centered beneath skilled hands. The potter leaned close. Pressed lightly. The shape rose. A smooth jar taking form. The rim widened. Then narrowed. Perfect balance. He wet his fingers and smoothed the surface. The clay glistened. Nearby older finished pieces dried in the sun. Bowls. Storage jars. Small cups. Everything useful. Everything needed. Clay touched nearly every part of life along the Nile. Holding grain. Holding water. Holding oil. Even simple things became important when shaped with care. Across the fields the farmers continued their work. The light had turned brighter now. The golden softness of early morning shifting toward midday. A stronger warmth settled over the land. But the river breeze still reached them. Cool enough to soften the heat. A farmer lifted a woven basket filled with weeds pulled from the edges of the canal. Another adjusted a narrow mud barrier. Water redirected. Flowing exactly where it was needed. A child walked behind carrying a smaller basket. Trying hard to match the adult's pace. Watching every movement. Learning without being told. The field itself seemed alive. Green rose moving gently. Water glimmering between narrow banks. Birds landing and lifting. The smell of wet earth rising warm beneath the sun. And always, beyond the fields the Nile. Wide and bright. A quiet presence. At the temple the courtyard stones reflected sunlight. White and warm. Servants moved carefully through shade carrying baskets and folded cloth. A priest paused beneath a column and looked toward the river. From there he could see boats moving along the shining water. The same view seen by countless eyes before him. Generation after generation. The river remained. Empires shifted. Buildings rose. People came and went. But morning along the Nile continued. Simple and dependable. A woman swept temple steps with a reed broom. Dust gathered. Lifted lightly. Then settled. Her movements slow and practiced. The scent of incense still lingered in the cooler inner rooms. Quiet and faint. Almost blending with stone and shadow. Near the riverbank, fishermen cleaned their catch. Knives flashed briefly. Silver scales dropped into woven trays. Water washed hands and baskets. A father passed cleaned fish to his daughter. She arranged them neatly. Ready for trade. ready for the household meal. A nearby heron stood in shallow water, completely still, watching. Its reflection trembled slightly with the current. Then it moved one careful step forward, and stopped again. The river taught patience to every creature beside it, even the birds. The traveler beneath the palm tree opened his eyes. The shade had shifted. A patch of sunlight touched the ground beside his sandals. He took another sip of water, then stood. His knees straightened slowly. He adjusted the bag across his shoulder, checked the rolled papyrus inside, then walked toward the dock. The cargo boat was nearly ready. Ropes secured, goods arranged, sail loose and waiting. A worker stepped aboard. Then another. The traveler followed. The wood beneath his feet creaked gently. The boat rocked once, then steadied. He placed his bag in shade near the stern, looked back toward the village. Palm roofs, mud brick walls, people moving through sunlight. A peaceful place, one among many. The captain untied the final rope. The sail lifted. The breeze caught it. The cloth billowed softly. The boat eased away from shore. Slowly, smoothly. The landing drifted farther behind. The traveler watched. The workers unloading baskets became smaller. The market path faded into the brightness. Children near the riverbank turned and waved towards someone on shore. Then the bend of reeds partly hid the village. The Nile opened wide ahead, glittering under the growing sun. The boat moved north, its shadow drifting over water. The river carried them past fields, past fishermen, past another landing where clay jars waited beneath shade. Everything felt connected. A long living ribbon of work and rest and daily life. On shore, the group of workers who had arrived from the fields began loading fresh flax onto another smaller boat. They lifted carefully, stacked evenly. A rope tightened around the bundles. One worker paused and wiped his forehead, then looked inland. Far beyond the first fields, near the edge where green farmland met dry open earth, a line of figures had begun appearing on the path. More workers, walking slowly toward the river beneath the brightening Egyptian sun. The line of workers coming from farther inland moved quietly through the brightness of late morning. From a distance they looked almost like shadows against the pale earth beyond the green fields. Slowly they became clearer. Sandals brushing dust. Linen garments moving gently in the breeze. Wooden poles balanced across shoulders. A few donkeys walking among them with baskets tied carefully at their sides. The path they followed had been pressed into the ground over many years. Thousands of footsteps. Farmers. Boatmen. Children carrying water. Travelers moving between villages. Temple workers. Merchants. Every day the same narrow route carried life toward the river and back again. Now it carried another morning's labor. The closer they came, the more details appeared. One basket held bundles of reeds freshly cut from canal edges. Another held vegetables gathered from garden plots. A donkey carried clay jars wrapped with cloth for protection. One older man leaned slightly on a walking staff as he moved, steady and calm. His pace never hurried. The others adjusted naturally around him. No rush. No pressure. The Nile was near. There was time. Always enough time for steady hands. At the landing the smaller flax boat was nearly loaded. Workers tightened ropes and checked balance. A man at the stern nudged one basket slightly to the left. Another tied down a loose corner. Everything secured carefully. Then they stepped back and looked. Satisfied. Nearby fishermen had finished cleaning their catch. Their baskets rested beneath shade. A few fish remained for sale. The rest would soon head toward kitchens and ovens. The smell of water and river reeds drifted through the air, mixed with warm dust. Fresh bread. Clay drying in sunlight. It felt like the full breath of the Nile morning. The inland workers reached the shoreline and began lowering their loads. A quiet exchange followed. A nod. A few calm words. Hands helping hands. One basket lifted from a donkey. Another carried toward shade. A jar passed carefully. A reed bundle stacked with the others. Everything settled into place. The landing looked busy now, but still orderly. Still peaceful. A movement with rhythm. Nothing sharp. Nothing chaotic. Only people doing familiar work together. Across the river a breeze brushed through papyrus. Tall green stems swayed. Sunlight flashed between them. Birds lifted and circled, then disappeared lower over the water. The river itself shimmered bright silver blue, its current smooth and constant. A small boat passed near shore carrying two children and an older woman. The children sat quietly. One held a covered basket. The woman guided the boat with steady hands. Her face relaxed. The current helped. The wind helped. The Nile did much of the work. The boat drifted gracefully past the landing. Past fishermen. Past stacked cargo. Then curved toward another stretch of reeds farther north. In the village the day moved deeper. The marketplace had softened a little. The busiest morning trade now settling. A few baskets half empty. Bread reduced to smaller stacks. The potter placed finished bowls into deeper shade. A woman lifted a cloth over dates to protect them from stronger sunlight. Children played near a shaded wall drawing shapes in dust with sticks. An older man repaired a fishing net nearby. Thread looping through his fingers. Pulling tight. Checking knots. Years of practice showed in every movement. A cat crossed through a shaft of sunlight. Paused. Then disappeared behind clay jars. The village felt warm. Comfortable. Steady. At one home near the edge of the fields, midday meal preparations had begun. A woman arranged vegetables on a flat stone. Onions. Greens. Fresh herbs. Nearby dough rested beneath cloth. A low clay oven warmed slowly. The smell drifting upward was rich and earthy. Inside the shaded courtyard a child slept on a woven mat. A breeze moved through the doorway. The linen curtain lifted and settled. Lifted and settled. Softly. Almost like breathing. Out in the fields the farmers kept working. Though the sun had risen high, they stayed steady. Canals still needed watching. Plants still needed care. One farmer stood ankle-deep beside the trench. His hands muddy. He shaped the edge of the channel with practiced movements. Water shifted. Spread wider. Then settled. Exactly right. He looked over the row. Satisfied. Then moved farther along. A younger boy followed carrying a small basket of tools. Trying hard to keep up. Trying hard to step where the older man stepped. Learning. Always learning. The smell of damp earth rose warm and clean. Birdsong came and went. And above everything, the bright blue sky remained clear. At the temple, midday shadows shortened. Columns cast narrow dark shapes against the courtyard stones. A servant poured cool water into a basin. The sound echoed softly. Another swept dust from the edge of a carved doorway. The work was small. Repeated. Important. The temple lived through ordinary care. Just like homes. Just like boats. A priest paused near an open entrance and listened to the breeze outside. From there he could hear faint sounds from the river. Oars touching water. Voices drifting. The cry of a bird. Even within stone walls the Nile made itself known. The traveler's boat had gone farther north by now. The shoreline behind him slowly changing. Different reeds. Different clusters of homes. Another field. Another landing. Yet all familiar. Each village shaped by the same river. Each morning beginning the same way. He sat near the stern and watched sunlight scatter across the surface. A worker adjusted the sail. The fabric snapped once. Then filled again. The boat glided onward. A fisherman farther out lifted his net. Water flashing bright as polished bronze. A heron stood motionless at the edge of reeds. The traveler looked ahead. The river curved gently. And beyond that curve another shoreline waited. Another delivery. Another set of hands. Back at the original landing, one of the inland workers untied a cloth from around a clay jar. He checked inside. Oil. Carefully sealed. He handed it to another man. That one placed it aboard the smaller flax boat. Then tied it securely. A final bundle followed. Then another. The boatman looked over everything. Weight balanced. Cargo stable. He nodded. Satisfied. The workers stepped back. A rope loosened. The boat shifted. Water brushed the wooden hull. The sail rose halfway. Then caught wind. And the smaller boat began moving away from shore. The workers remained on the bank watching it glide north. Its cargo bright under the sun. Its shadow trembling across the river. A beautiful ordinary sight. Seen so often. Yet always calming. A woman with a jar arrived from the village path. Then another. They knelt near the edge. Filled the jars. Lifted carefully. Water dripping down smooth clay. The river remained cool even under bright sun. One woman paused and looked across the surface. At the boats. At the reeds. At the moving reflections. Then lifted her jar and turned back toward home. Palm leaves rustled overhead. A breeze passed. The landing quieted a little after the boats departed. Still active. But calmer. A fisherman sat repairing rope. A donkey rested in shade. A worker drank water from cupped hands. The sunlight reflected from the Nile and danced against nearby stone. And from farther south, just beginning to appear through bright haze and rippling water, another long boat came into view. Its sail pale against the blue sky. Its bow cutting gently through sunlight as it moved toward the shore. By the time the sun had fully lifted above the eastern bank, the Nile had changed again. The silver quiet of dawn had become warm gold. Light stretched across the river in long ribbons. The water moved slowly and carried that brightness with it, breaking it into little shining pieces that drifted south and north and then gathered again. The reeds along the bank looked greener now. The mud paths beside the houses had dried a little on top, though underneath they still held the cool dampness left by the night. And all through the village, morning work continued. Nothing hurried. Nothing sharp. Only the soft steady rhythm of another day beginning beside the river. A young father stepped from his doorway carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. The rope had been twisted by hand from flax fibers weeks earlier. It was rough and pale and strong. He had made most of it himself while sitting outside after sunset with neighbors nearby. Now he walked toward the mooring posts near the bank. His sandals pressed into soft ground. Behind him his little son followed carefully, carrying a wooden peg with both hands as though it were a great treasure. The peg was almost too large for him. He held it tightly. Every few steps he looked up at his father. The man smiled but said little. There was no need. The boy already understood this morning. He knew they were checking a small fishing boat before the stronger sunlight came. He knew where the pegs were stored. He knew which knots his father liked. And he knew that carrying even one piece of wood made him feel useful. The boat rested partly in mud and partly in shallow water. Its narrow shape had darkened over time from river water and sun. The father crouched beside it and ran a hand along the side. He checked for cracks. He checked the rope bindings. He checked where old repairs had been sealed. The child stood beside him and watched every movement. He passed over the peg. The father pushed it into place. Then he tied rope around it and tightened it with practiced hands. The knot was quick, strong, simple. Done the same way many times before. The boy studied it carefully. One day his own hands would move like that. The father lifted the boat a little. The boy leaned in to help. The boat shifted. Water slid under it. The reeds nearby whispered. A bird lifted from the bank and crossed low over the river. The father finally nodded. The boat was ready. Not for long travel. Just for the short movements of morning. Fishing. Checking nets. Crossing to nearby plots. Watching water levels. The many small things river life always asked for. A little farther inland, women had gathered beside flat stones to grind grain. The steady sound returned. Stone against stone. Slow circles. Soft scraping. A familiar music. One woman leaned forward and poured wheat into the shallow hollow. Another began turning the upper stone. The grain broke apart. The smell rose warm and dry. A child nearby played with a broken pottery shard in the dust. He drew little lines in the earth. Then erased them with his foot. Then drew again. A dog passed by slowly and sniffed near the doorway. Someone called gently. The dog settled down in shade. A grandmother sat near the grinding stones and pulled flax fibers through her fingers. Long strands. Even and smooth. She twisted them together. Then again. Her hands worked without pause. Without thought. The fibers became thread. The thread would become cloth. And the cloth would become wraps and work garments and sacks and bandages and small things needed every day. Her granddaughter sat beside her. Quiet. Watching. Sometimes asking a question. Sometimes trying with her own fingers. The older woman corrected her softly. Not with impatience. Only with care. The child tried again. And slowly the fibers obeyed. Morning sunlight reached farther. It touched rooftops. It warmed mud walls. It brightened baskets and jars. It found the broad green leaves near the water. It painted palm trunks in gold. And all across the village the day deepened. A farmer walked toward the fields carrying a wooden hoe. He had walked this same path many thousands of times. His feet knew every turn. The ground changed beneath him. Soft near the river. Firmer farther out. Then damp again where irrigation channels crossed. The field ahead glowed green. Not all crops grew the same height. Some stood tall and narrow. Others low and dense. Each patch had its own texture. its own smell, its own shade of green. He stepped between rows and crouched. His fingers touched soil. Still moist. Good. He pulled away a few weeds. Adjusted a little ridge. Pressed mud near a channel. Then stood. Nearby another farmer was already working. They nodded. A few words passed between them. Quiet. Easy. The kind of conversation that needed no effort. About the water. About crops. About someone's repaired roof. About a child who had started helping in the mornings. Then silence again. Not uncomfortable. Only natural. Birdsong drifted through the air. The wind moved lightly over the grain. And somewhere behind them, from the riverbank, came the gentle splash of an oar. A fisherman had pushed away from shore. His boat glided slowly. The movement looked almost effortless. The Nile accepted him. Held him. Carried him. He moved along the edge of reeds. Watching carefully. He lifted a net. Water streamed through. Small silver fish flashed. He sorted them quickly into baskets. Then lowered the net again. His shoulders moved slowly. Steady. The boat rocked. Water tapped wood. Sunlight shimmered around him. He knew where fish gathered. He knew where water stayed deeper. He knew how shadows shifted under reeds. He had learned from his father. And before that from another father. The river taught through repetition. Morning after morning. Season after season. Year after year. At one house, bread was ready. A woman pulled warm flat loaves from clay. Steam lifted gently. She placed them on woven mats. The smell drifted outward. Children noticed immediately. A little girl laughed and reached. The woman smiled and tore a small piece. The child took it with both hands. Still warm. Still soft. She ate standing in sunlight. Then ran toward the yard. Another child followed. Dust rose behind their feet. They circled a tree. Stopped. Looked toward the river. Then started again. Their shadows stretched long behind them. Older boys nearby were helping carry baskets. Not playing now. Working. A little serious. Trying hard. One balanced dates in a woven tray. Another carried reeds cut earlier. Their steps were careful. Adults watched but said little. The boys wanted to prove they could manage. And mostly they did. A basket slipped once. Dates rolled. Everyone laughed softly. Then gathered them. Then continued. No one rushed. There was always time for work done carefully. Near the village edge, an older man repaired a simple tool handle. He sat cross-legged beneath a patch of shade. Wood shavings curled beside him. A blade rested nearby. His fingers turned the handle. He shaved a little. Checked shape. Smoothed it again. The wood smelled fresh. A younger man arrived carrying another broken piece. They spoke quietly. Compared sizes. Adjusted one end. Shared a nod. The older man kept carving. Above them, the sky had turned clear blue. The pale morning softness remained close to the river, but farther up the brightness had deepened. A heron stood still in shallow water. Watching. Waiting. Then suddenly moved. Then still again. The Nile continued its slow motion. Never fully still. Never hurried. Its surface carried bits of reed. Reflections. Small ripples. A passing leaf. The wide current looked peaceful. Yet beneath it life moved constantly. Fish. Mud. Roots. Water plants bending. The deep hidden work of the river. And on shore the village followed that rhythm. A woman rinsed pottery at the water's edge. She dipped each jar carefully. Turned it. Washed away dust. Set it upright in sunlight. Another filled containers with river water. Balanced them. Lifted. Walked back home. Each step measured. Each motion practiced. Children watched and sometimes copied with tiny bowls. Trying to help. Trying to feel grown. A baby rested asleep in shade nearby. Breathing slow. One hand open. The world around him continued. Birds. Voices. Grinding stone. Water. Footsteps. Palm leaves moving. Yet he slept peacefully through it all. This sound was home. This rhythm had surrounded him since birth. Even before memory. And farther across the water another village was beginning exactly the same. Smoke rising. Boats shifting. Workers walking. Fields waking. Animals moving. Morning spreading. Many communities. Many lives. Connected by one river. One flow. One long green path through dry land. The Nile tied them together. Fed them. Moved with them. Asked things of them. And gave in return. The villagers understood that without needing grand words. They understood with hands in wet soil. With baskets lifted. With grain ground. With ropes tied. With eyes lifted each dawn toward water and sky. The sun rose a little higher. Heat began touching shoulders. Shadows shortened. The cool edge of dawn slowly disappeared. But its peace remained. A calm stayed over everything. Work continued. Measured and even. And down near the fishing boat the father from earlier pushed away from shore at last. His son stood ankle deep in water watching. The boat slid outward. The rope loosened. The oar dipped. Water opened. Then closed behind. The boy lifted one hand. The father looked back. Smiled. And continued out along the shining river. While behind him the village carried on beneath the growing light of morning. And the Nile moved gently onward beside them all. The morning grew warmer little by little. Not suddenly. Not in a way anyone needed to notice. Only a quiet shift. The kind that settled over the skin and changed the feel of the air. The coolness that had rested over the river before sunrise had begun to lift. In its place came a softer warmth. Gentle and golden. The Nile reflected the higher sun now. The silver color from dawn had become brighter. More alive. Light danced across the surface in long broken shapes. Every ripple carried it. Every small movement turned brightness into pieces. And along the banks, reeds leaned and straightened in the breeze. Their shadows moved slowly across damp ground. The fishing boat had drifted farther from shore. The father stood with his feet wide for balance. His wooden oar dipped into the water. Then rose. Then dipped again. Smooth. Steady. No wasted movement. The river answered every stroke. The boat turned slightly. Then glided toward a patch of reeds where fish often gathered. His son remained on shore. Still watching. The child stood with both feet in the mud, toes sinking a little deeper each time he shifted. The water touched his ankles. Cool and soft. He liked the feeling. He looked at the boat. Then down at the river. Then back again. He could already imagine the day he would step aboard and help cast nets. Not just watch. Not just carry pegs. But move with the boat itself. For now he waited. And that waiting felt important too. A woman nearby bent over a shallow basket washing green onions and herbs. She dipped them in river water. Lifted them. Shook away drops. The sunlight caught on each wet leaf. Fresh smells rose into the air. Sharp and earthy. She arranged the greens in order. Then stood. Balanced the basket on one hip. And walked home. Her feet followed the narrow path worn smooth by many years. The edges of the path were lined with reeds and flattened grass. A lizard slipped across warm earth and vanished beneath stone. A clay jar sat outside one doorway cooling in shade. Its surface darkened where water had been splashed against it. Inside, someone hummed quietly. The sound drifted through the open doorway and out into the day. Soft. Slow. Almost blending with the breeze. Near the grainstones, work had continued without pause. The women there had settled into rhythm. Turn. Scrape. Pour. Turn again. Hands moved in practiced patterns. Grain became flour. Flour gathered in bowls. One woman paused to wipe her forehead. Another passed her water. No words needed. Just a quick nod. Then back to work. A child sat beside them threading beads made from dried clay. Her fingers worked carefully. The beads slipped and clicked against each other. She frowned when one fell. Then smiled when she found it. Then kept going. Her grandmother glanced down and adjusted one knot. Then returned to spinning flax. Every movement held patience. No one tried to finish quickly. There was always another basket. Another loaf. Another thread. Another quiet task waiting. And that was the shape of life here. Morning brought work. Work brought rhythm. Rhythm brought peace. Out in the fields, irrigation channels glimmered. Thin lines of water winding between rows. Farmers bent low and checked each section. The mud ridges had to stay strong. Water had to move evenly. Too much in one place could flood roots. Too little could leave the soil thirsty. A farmer crouched and pressed mud with both hands. He shaped the edge carefully. Water changed direction. It moved into a dry patch. Perfect. He stood. Looked. Adjusted one more small place. Then nodded. Nearby his brother cut stalks with a simple blade. Each motion clean. The stalks were stacked neatly. Birds landed and hopped nearby looking for insects stirred from the earth. The men barely noticed. They had seen this every season. The birds knew where work happened. The land and animals followed each other closely. A goat bleated from near the village. A woman answered absent-mindedly while hanging damp cloth in sunlight. The cloth fluttered. Then settled. Palm leaves overhead rustled. A few dates dropped onto sand. A boy hurried to gather them before chickens arrived. He tucked them into his tunic and laughed. Then walked back proudly. An older sister teased him. He offered her one. Then ate another himself. The sweetness lingered. Farther downriver, a narrow boat passed. Two men aboard carried bundled reeds. Their vessel slid close to shore. One raised a hand. Someone on land waved back. They called a greeting across the water. The sound carried clearly. Then faded. The boat continued. Its wake spread gently. Touched reeds. Touched mud. Then disappeared. The Nile always connected movement like this. Villages talking across distance. Goods moving quietly. Fish. Grain. Papyrus. Tools. News. Simple exchanges. Nothing rushed. Even travel belonged to the rhythm. The river decided the pace. And everyone learned to trust it. Back at the fishing boat, the father lowered a woven trap. It disappeared beneath green-brown water. He waited. His face calm. His shoulders relaxed. The boat drifted a little. Then he pulled. Water poured through reeds tied together. Small fish flashed inside. Enough for the morning meal and perhaps extra to dry later. He emptied the catch carefully. Then lowered the trap again. The work was repetitive. And peaceful. Sun warmed his back. Birds called overhead. The river rocked the boat. The smell of water and wet reeds surrounded him. The same smells he had known since childhood. The same light. The same quiet labor. On shore, his son had finally turned toward home. He carried a little reed bundle gathered near the bank. Important work of his own. He walked slowly, trying not to drop any. A dog followed behind. Then passed him. Then circled back. At the doorway his mother saw him. Smiled. And accepted the reeds like a serious delivery. He stood taller. Proud. She set the bundle aside for later. Then handed him a small piece of warm bread. He ate quickly. Crumbs on his fingers. Then went back out. Because morning still felt wide and full. Near the center of the village, shade had shortened. The ground warmed beneath bare feet. People adjusted. Moved baskets a little farther from direct sun. Shifted tools. Set water jars where they stayed coolest. An older woman sprinkled water across packed earth near her doorway. Dust settled. The air smelled fresh. She sat afterward and rested for a moment. Watching others pass. A neighbor stopped briefly. They exchanged a few quiet words. About harvest. About a roof repair. About a daughter learning weaving. Then smiled. And continued. Children crossed the open space carrying tiny baskets. A rooster strutted nearby. A cat slept stretched long against warm wall clay. Flies buzzed lightly and drifted away. Everything moved in soft patterns. Nothing sharp. Nothing sudden. Even sound seemed rounded by the warmth. The grinding stones. The wind. A distant splash. The tapping of wood. Voices low and calm. The Nile itself seemed brighter now. Sunlight spread across its width. Reflections shimmered against the underside of boats. A crocodile farther downriver slid from mud into water without sound. Only a ripple remained. Birds perched on branches above. Watching. Waiting. Life along the river continued in many layers. Seen and unseen. Near and far. The fishermen. The farmers. The women shaping dough. The elders weaving thread. Children chasing shadows. Birds skimming water. Fish below. The slow turning of morning toward midday. Every piece connected. And always the river nearby. Moving. Breathing. Holding them together. A farmer paused in his field and straightened his back. He looked toward the village. Saw smoke rising from cooking fires. He heard faint voices. Saw the shine of the Nile beyond. He stood there only a moment. Then lowered his hands to work again. The field needed him. The soil felt rich beneath his feet. The crops answered good care. He pressed forward row by row. The sun climbed. And the village continued with calm certainty. Morning had fully awakened now. Yet it still carried that peaceful beginning. Still held traces of dawn. In the warmth. In the light. In the slow pace of hands and water and wind. And beside the reeds, the father's fishing boat drifted a little farther south. The woven trap rose again. More fish glimmered in the sunlight. He emptied them into the basket. Set the trap once more. Then let the current carry him a little farther. Quietly. Gently. As the Nile moved onward beneath the brightening sky. The sun climbed higher over the Nile. Its light had become clearer now. Stronger. Still gentle in the way morning often was, but bright enough to warm the tops of shoulders and make the river sparkle so sharply that sometimes a person narrowed their eyes when looking across it. The sky had turned a clean pale blue. Only a faint trace of dawn remained near the horizon. Palm trees cast shorter shadows. The damp places near the shore slowly began drying at the surface. And everywhere, the steady work of the morning continued. Along the riverbank, the fisherman guided his boat toward a shallow bend where the reeds grew thick and green. The current moved carefully there. Not fast. Only enough to press gently against the hull. He rested one hand against the edge of the boat. The wood felt warm now. He could hear tiny sounds all around him. Water tapping against reeds. A bird lifting from the bank. A fish turning beneath the surface. Even the creak of rope sounded familiar and calm. He lowered his woven trap again. Waited. Watched. Then lifted. A few bright fish shimmered inside. He placed them into a basket lined with damp reeds to keep them cool. Then he paused and let the boat drift. There was no need to rush. The river offered its gifts in its own time. Back in the village, a young woman stepped outside carrying a wide clay bowl balanced against her hip. Inside it was dough mixed earlier before sunrise. She set the bowl beside a shaded wall and knelt. Her hands pressed and folded slowly. The dough gave beneath her palms. Soft. Warm. Smooth. A little flour dusted the air. She shaped flat rounds and laid them carefully onto a board. Beside her, an older woman prepared the clay oven. Ashes were moved. Heat checked. A little more dried fuel added. Soon the bread would bake. The smell would drift through the village. And people would know without looking. Morning bread was ready. A little farther away, children carried water from the river in small jars. Not the heavy jars adults carried. These were smaller. Just enough to help. They walked carefully. Trying not to spill. One little boy held his jar too tightly and water splashed against his arm. He stopped. Looked down. Then continued with careful seriousness. His sister beside him smiled but said nothing. They reached home and poured the water into a larger clay vessel waiting in shade. The cool sound echoed softly. Then both children hurried back toward the river. Ready to help again. At the edge of the fields, farmers worked side by side. Their feet sank slightly into wet soil. Hands adjusted channels. Wooden hose broke small clumps. Water flowed where it was guided. A man bent low and cleared weeds from between young stalks. His movements were slow but exact. Nearby another farmer cut reeds growing too close to the irrigation line. They spoke now and then. Only a sentence or two. About the condition of the mud. About where water had risen overnight. About whose son had started helping earlier this season. Their words came between long stretches of silence. Comfortable silence. The kind shared by people working close together. Birds walked through shallow edges of water looking for insects. Tiny ripples spread around their legs. Farther off, cattle stood near a muddy patch flicking their tails. A young boy watched them with a long stick resting against his shoulder. He looked serious, though now and then he crouched to draw lines in wet earth with the end of the stick. Then stood again. Then watched. The air carried smells of wet soil and warm clay. Fresh cut reeds. Baking bread. River water. Palm bark heated by sun. The scents blended softly together. The village itself felt fully awake. At one doorway, strips of linen had been hung to dry. They moved gently with the breeze. At another, someone sat repairing a basket. The reeds bent beneath steady fingers. In the shade near a wall, an older man polished a copper blade with sand and cloth. Turning it slowly. Checking its edge. Light flashed across the metal. Then softened. Then flashed again. Nearby, a small child sat beside him with complete concentration. Holding a pebble. Copying the motion on another stone. The old man smiled quietly but kept working. Down at the bank, a group of women washed clothing against smooth stones. They knelt close to the water. Dipped linen. Pressed. Lifted. Rinsed again. Their conversation stayed soft. Gentle voices. A shared laugh. Then more quiet. Water streamed from cloth back into the river. Sunlight glimmered in the drops. The Nile carried everything onward. Light. Sound. Reflection. Boats. Bits of reed. The shadow of birds crossing overhead. Its surface looked calm. But beneath it life moved continuously. The current pulling south. Fish weaving between plants. Mud shifting along the riverbed. Roots drinking deeply. The river worked even when it appeared still. And the people beside it understood that. They built their lives around that hidden motion. They woke with it. Worked beside it. Rested because of it. Trusted it. A fisherman farther downstream passed close enough to call out. The man in the boat near the reeds lifted a hand in greeting. A few words crossed the water. Then drifted away. The second boat continued north. Bundles of papyrus stacked near the bow. The stalks green and fresh cut. Soon they would be dried and pressed. Useful for writing. For mats. For rope. For many quiet practical things. Nothing went to waste. Every part of the river offered something. Children ran through a patch of open ground chasing each other around stacked baskets. Their feet kicked up light dust. A dog joined for a moment. Then gave up and settled back into shade. A little girl stopped running and looked toward the bread ovens. She could smell them now. Warm and rich. She wandered closer. The woman baking smiled. Tore off a small piece. Still hot. The girl blew on it carefully. Then ate. Her eyes brightened. Then she skipped away. Near the village edge, a carpenter shaped wood beneath a simple shelter. The shade kept the tools cool. He measured with his eyes. Trimmed a narrow piece. Turned it. Trimmed again. Wood chips fell into a growing pile. The scent was clean and dry. A younger apprentice beside him sanded a handle smooth with stone. The older man corrected him once. Quietly. Demonstrating with his own hands. Then handed it back. The apprentice nodded. Tried again. Better this time. Learning came slowly here. Patiently. By watching, repeating, trying, correcting, then repeating again. Just like rowing. Just like planting. Just like weaving flax. The Nile taught patience. The land rewarded patience. And every task seemed built around it. The sun continued upward. The bright edge of morning moved closer to midday. Shadows gathered beneath feet instead of stretching long behind. People noticed but did not hurry. Water jars were checked. Tools shifted into shade. A woman covered prepared dough with cloth. A farmer drank from a cup and wiped his brow. A child settled under a palm tree and rested for a few quiet moments. The breeze still came off the river. Cooling enough. Gentle enough. A welcome touch against warm skin. The fisherman near the reeds pulled his trap again. A better catch this time. Several fish flashed silver and gray. He placed them carefully in the basket. Looked toward shore. And saw his son there again. The child had returned. Standing knee-deep now. Watching every movement with complete focus. The father smiled. Lifted the trap slightly so the boy could see. The child grinned. The sunlight touched his face. The river rippled around his legs. For a moment neither spoke. They didn't need to. The lesson was already happening. Seen. Remembered. Saved quietly for later years. Then the father lowered the trap once more. And the boat drifted a little farther along the bank. The reeds whispered around him. Birds circled above. The Nile kept shining. And morning continued its slow peaceful turning beneath the widening blue sky. By now, the Nile had fully settled into its late morning rhythm. The light was no longer soft like dawn, and not yet heavy like the heat of afternoon. It sat somewhere in between. Clear. Bright. Steady. The kind of sunlight that made everything visible without making anything feel rushed. On the water, small waves formed where the breeze touched the surface. Not strong waves. Only gentle movement. Enough to break the reflections of palm trees and boats into shifting lines of gold and blue. A few fishing boats remained close to shore. Others had drifted farther out, following the quiet logic of currents and habit. One boat moved slowly along a reed line where the water turned slightly darker. The fisherman inside leaned forward. Watching. Waiting. His hands rested lightly on the oar. There was no need to force the river. Only to follow it. He lifted his net again. The motion was simple now. Almost automatic. Throw. Wait. Pull. Water slipped through woven fibers. A few fish caught the light and flashed briefly before being gathered into a basket. He nodded to himself. Not in celebration. Only acknowledgement. Enough for now. Enough for the morning. On the shore, the boy watched from a new spot. He had moved farther down the bank without realizing it. Bare feet sinking into damp earth, then firmer sand, then back again. He followed the boat with his eyes as if it were the only moving thing in the world. But it wasn't. Behind him, life in the village continued without pause. A woman passed carrying a bundle of reeds on her head. Balanced carefully. Her steps even. A man followed carrying a wooden frame that would become part of a storage rack. Two children ran past chasing a rolling clay ball. A goat wandered near a doorway and was gently guided away with a soft hand. Everything moved. Everything connected. The river simply reflected it all. At the landing, a new group of workers arrived carrying clay jars sealed with cloth. They came from a nearby workshop where potters had been shaping vessels since before sunrise. The jars were warm from the sun now. Not fragile exactly, but needing care. Always care. They were set down in the shade one by one. A worker checked each lid. Another tapped gently to test for soundness. A third arranged them so they would not touch too closely. Small decisions. Careful movements. Nothing wasted. Nearby, a boat prepared for departure. Its sail was loose, hanging like folded cloth. The ropes were checked again. Knots pressed. Edges adjusted. A man stepped aboard and tested the balance with a slow shift of weight. The boat rocked slightly. Then settled. Everything ready. The river would decide the rest. A little farther inland, the grain storage building had grown cooler again after being warmed earlier by morning activity. Inside, the air was still and quiet. Large baskets lined the walls, filled with harvested grain from earlier seasons. The smell was dry and comforting. A scribe passed through briefly, checking a record tablet. He traced marks with his eyes, counted silently, then moved on. Outside, he paused under shade. A cat brushed past his feet. He did not look down, only continued walking. In the fields, the farmers had begun to slow slightly. Not stopping. Never stopping. But shifting into steadier, less intense movements. A man stood upright for a longer moment than before. Watching water flow through a channel. Adjusting nothing. Just observing. His brother nearby leaned on a hoe and took a drink from a skin pouch. They exchanged a few words. Then returned to work. The sun was higher now. Shadows shorter. Heat more present. But still manageable. The Nile breeze continued to move through fields and paths. A constant reminder of where the river lay. Even when unseen behind reeds and buildings. At the temple, the inner halls remained cool. Stone held onto morning's chill longer than earth or wood. Priests moved through corridors where sunlight barely reached. Incense had faded now, leaving only the faint memory of scent in the air. A servant placed fresh water near an altar. Another adjusted a linen cloth. Everything precise. Everything quiet. Even ritual followed the rhythm of the day. Nothing hurried. Nothing excessive. Only what was needed. Outside the temple walls, the world was brighter. A woman passed carrying bread to another household. A boy ran an errand with a small basket. A man led a donkey loaded with reeds. Each person moving along familiar paths. Each path slowly warmed by sun. Back at the river, the fisherman's son had now stepped fully into the shallow water. Not deep. Just enough to feel the current around his ankles. He bent down and touched the surface. It was cool beneath the sun-warmed top layer. He laughed softly to himself. Then looked up again toward the boat. The father lifted another net. Water streamed down in thin lines. A few fish caught the light. Then were placed carefully into the basket. The work continued. Unhurried. Balanced. As if the river itself was teaching the pace. Further along the bank, another small boat passed. Two women inside were sorting reeds. One tied bundles. The other checked lengths. They spoke quietly. Their boat moved with the current more than with effort. A rope trailed lightly behind, dipping into the water. It left a faint line across the surface. Then disappeared. On shore, a group of children had gathered near a shaded wall where the ground was cool. They were drawing shapes in dust again. A house. A boat. A line that might be the river. They erased and redrew. argued softly. Then agreed. Then changed it again. Their voices were low. Occasional laughter. Then silence as they focused. Nearby, an older woman watched them while repairing a basket. Her fingers moved quickly. Even without looking directly. She knew the rhythm of both tasks. Watching children. Weaving reeds. Both required patience. Both required attention. The sun continued its slow rise toward its highest point. The river brightened further. Almost dazzling in places where sunlight struck directly. Boats became silhouettes against the glare. Then returned to detail as they moved into shade again. The fisherman finished another pass with his net. He rested for a moment. Just sitting in the boat. Or lying across the edge. Water gently tapping wood. He looked toward shore. Toward the boy. Toward the village. Toward everything that remained steady and familiar. Then he moved again. Because the river was always moving. And so were the lives built upon it. In the distance, another bend of the Nile curved out of view. Beyond that bend, more fields waited. More boats. More villages. More mornings just like this one. And the current carried everything forward without effort. As if it had always known the way. The river bent gently beyond the reeds, and the Nile seemed to widen as it turned. From the shore it looked like a slow unfolding of water, as if the land itself was opening to let it pass through. The light had grown stronger now. Late morning leaning toward midday. Everything touched by sun carried a warmer tone. Mud brick walls turned soft orange. Palm trunks deepened in color. Even the water, where it caught the light directly, looked almost white gold for a moment before returning to blue-green shadow. The fisherman's boat drifted along that bend. The net now rested across the side, dripping slowly. The small sounds of water falling back into the river continued in steady rhythm. Drip. Pause. Drip. Then silence. Then again. His son stood in the shallows watching until the boat turned slightly and the angle changed. Now he could see less of his father and more of the boat's shadow moving across the riverbed. He did not leave. He stayed where he was. Feet planted in soft mud. Hands loosely at his sides. Eyes fixed on the water as if trying to understand everything happening beneath it. The river looked calm from above. But the boy was beginning to notice the small changes. A flicker of movement near reeds. A sudden ripple that did not match the wind. A dark shape that moved and disappeared again. He did not yet have words for it. But he was learning to see. And that learning was quiet. Unspoken. Like most things along the Nile. On the bank behind him, a woman stepped out of her home carrying a bundle of freshly washed linen. The cloth was heavy with water. She paused briefly in the sun, letting it drip. Then moved toward a rope stretched between two wooden posts. One by one, she spread the fabric across it. White against green reeds. White against blue sky. White against warm earth. The wind caught it gently. The cloth lifted and settled. Lifted and settled. A slow breathing motion. She stepped back to inspect it. Then nodded to herself and turned away. Another task complete. Nearby, a man sharpened a bronze blade against a smooth stone. The sound was faint. Almost like sand moving. He tested the edge with his thumb carefully. Then adjusted his grip and continued. Beside him, a younger man watched closely. Waiting for instruction. Learning without interruption. The older man said nothing for a long time. Then finally gestured once. A small movement of the hand. The younger man took the blade and tried himself. Not perfect, but close enough. The older man nodded once. And that was enough. At the landing, activity had shifted again. A cargo boat had arrived from upstream. Its sail partly lowered now, folding into soft layers. Workers were already unloading bundles of papyrus and baskets of dried fish. The smell of river travel clung to everything. Water, wood, reeds, sun-baked rope. A man stepped off the boat and stretched slowly. His joints stiff from hours of sitting and watching current. He looked around the landing. Saw familiar faces. Saw familiar work. And relaxed slightly. No need for words. He was home enough for now. A woman approached and handed him a small cup of water. He drank it without speaking. Then returned the cup with a nod. Simple exchange. Enough said. Nearby, children ran along the edge of the water chasing floating reeds that had broken free upstream. One reed spun slowly in a small eddy. The children followed it until it caught on a stone. Then they lost interest and moved on. Their laughter drifted briefly across the landing. Then faded into the broader sounds of work. At the fields, the farmers had entered a slower phase of movement. Not less work. Just steadier work. The urgency of early morning irrigation had passed. Now they checked. Adjusted. Cleaned. Washed. One man walked slowly along the canal edge with his hands behind his back. He observed how the water spread into each section of soil. He stopped often. Kneeled. Touched the earth. Then moved again. His son followed behind carrying a small container of seeds. Ready for later planting. Ready for tomorrow's tasks. The rhythm of farming never truly ended. It only changed shape across the day. At the temple, the inner courtyard grew brighter as sunlight shifted angle. Even the shaded areas no longer felt as cool as before. Servants moved with slower steps now. Work becoming more routine. Less urgent. A priest stood near a carved pillar and looked outward through the gate. He could see the river in the distance. A thin shining line cutting across the land. He watched it for a long time without moving. Then turned back inside. At the river's edge, the fisherman finally pulled his boat a little closer to shore. Not fully returning yet. Just near enough to rest. He set the oar down carefully. And for the first time that morning, he leaned back slightly. The boy still stood in the water. Now ankle deep, now knee deep depending on how the river shifted under him. He bent down and scooped water into his hands. Let it fall back. Watched it disappear into ripples. He did it again. And again. As if testing the river's texture. Learning its feel. The father watched quietly. No instruction. Only observation. The lesson was already happening without words. Nearby, another small boat passed carrying woven baskets of grain. A man stood at the bow guiding it with a long pole. The boat moved slowly along the bank. The current did most of the work. Behind him, stacked goods shifted slightly but remained secure. Rope held everything in place. Everything balanced. Everything stable. On shore, a woman paused with a basket of fruit. She adjusted it on her hip and looked toward the river. Not directly at anything in particular. Just watching. As people often did. The river was never only work. It was also a place to pause. A place to breathe. A place where silence felt natural. Even in motion. Even with activity all around. The sun reached higher still. The sky now fully bright. The breeze from the Nile remained but felt warmer. Less cooling. More present than refreshing. People adapted. Moved into shade more often. Drank water more frequently. Shifted tasks where possible. The day was entering its stronger phase. Yet nothing broke its calm. Everything continued. The fishermen. The farmers. The weavers. The children. The scribes. The boatmen. All moving through the same wide slow current of daily life. The Nile carried it all forward. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just steadily. And as another boat appeared in the distance along the bend, its sail catching light like a pale moving shape against the sky, the river's long morning story continued without pause. The distant sail that appeared along the bend grew slowly larger as it came closer. At first it was only a pale shape against the bright sky. Then it became a boat. Then a moving presence on the water. Its sail caught the wind in a soft, steady curve, and the hull cut through the surface with almost no sound. The river accepted it the way it accepted everything else. Without resistance. Without urgency. Just flow. On shore, people noticed it only gradually. A fisherman resting in his boat lifted his head. A woman carrying water paused for a moment. A child pointed without speaking. Then continued walking. The boat moved closer to the landing, but it did not rush. No boat ever rushed on the Nile unless forced by necessity. Even then, the river set the limits. The vessel carried bundles wrapped in cloth. Papyrus. Reeds. Perhaps grain from another village farther upstream. Perhaps written records or simple trade goods. Everything carefully tied down. Everything arranged to survive motion. A man stood at the bow guiding it with a long pole. His movements were slow and practiced. He read the water more than he steered it. A slight shift of current. A change in color where the river deepened. A line of reeds bending in a certain direction. These were the signals. And he followed them. On the bank, the fisherman's son had moved a little farther out into the shallows. Now the water reached just above his knees. He held his arms slightly out for balance. Not afraid. Just aware. The river was stronger here. Still gentle, but less predictable. He felt the pull of it around his legs. It was like standing inside something alive. He turned his head when he noticed the approaching boat. His eyes followed it carefully. The boat seemed larger now. Its sail pale and glowing in sunlight. It passed behind a cluster of reeds and then reappeared closer to the landing. The boy stayed still. Watching. Learning. The father remained seated in the fishing boat nearby. He said nothing. But his eyes also followed the movement. Not concern. Only attention. Everything on the river mattered in small ways. Position. Timing. Distance. Current. A boat arriving too quickly could disturb fishing. A sudden turn could shift nets. A wake could scatter fish for a time. So everything was noticed. Everything quietly understood. The arriving boat slowed as it neared the landing. The sail loosened. The pole guide adjusted angle. The hull turned slightly to align with the shore. Ropes were already being prepared by workers waiting at the edge. Hands held coils of flax rope. Feet stood in shallow mud. Eyes tracked the boat's approach. It came in smoothly. Touched water near the bank. Slowed again. Then settled. A rope was thrown. Caught. Pulled tight. And the boat became part of the landing. Still floating. but no longer moving forward. The river now held it in place. Workers stepped aboard. One by one. Careful with balance. The cargo was examined quickly. Then lifted. Papyrus bundles first. Then smaller wrapped goods. Then baskets of grain. Everything passed from boat to shore in steady rhythm. No noise beyond quiet coordination. A nod. A pull. A lift. A set down. The fisherman's son watched all of it. He had seen boats arrive before. But each time felt slightly new. Each movement offered something to notice. How the rope tightened. How the boat shifted when weight changed. How water reacted to human steps. He noticed these things without knowing their importance yet. But they were being stored. Quietly. Inside him. The father finally pushed his own boat a little closer to shore. Not docking fully. Just drifting near enough that he could step out if needed. He lifted a basket of fish and checked it again. The catch was steady. Not large. Not small. Enough. Always enough for this kind of morning. He looked toward the landing briefly. Then back to the river. The sun was higher now. The brightness stronger. Shadows shorter. The heat beginning to settle more firmly into the land. People moved more often into shade. Hands reached for water more frequently. But work did not stop. It only adjusted. The women near the washing stones finished one set of linen and began another. The cloth now drying on ropes fluttered in a warmer breeze. The grinding stones continued their slow rhythm in shaded courtyards. Fields still demanded attention. Canals still needed watching. Boats still needed loading and unloading. The river never paused. And neither did the life around it. At the temple, the final preparations of the late morning had begun to settle into quieter repetition. Offerings were arranged again where needed. Water jars refilled. Floors swept once more. Not because they were dirty. But because care was part of order. Order was part of peace. And peace was part of daily life. A priest passed through the courtyard and briefly looked toward the river again. It was brighter now. Almost shimmering. He stood still for a moment. Then continued walking. At the landing, the arrived boat was now fully unloaded. Its cargo stacked neatly under shade. The crew rested briefly nearby. One man drank water slowly. Another checked rope bindings. A third sat with his back against a post and closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Then opened them again. Ready for the next task. Always ready. A small boy ran across the landing carrying an empty basket. He moved quickly but carefully between adults. He nearly bumped into a stack of reeds but stopped just in time. Someone laughed softly. He continued without embarrassment. Only focus. Only purpose. The fisherman's son finally stepped back toward shore. Water slid off his legs as he walked through the shallows. He paused once and turned to look at the river again. Then at the boats. Then at the landing. Everything felt connected. Even if he did not yet understand how. He climbed onto the bank. Mud clung briefly to his feet. He stood beside his father's boat again. Now closer to land. The father placed one hand on the boat's edge and pulled it slightly forward. A small adjustment. Then stopped. Both of them looked out across the river together. The water stretched wide. Boats moving in different directions. Light breaking across the surface in shifting gold and blue. Reeds bending. Birds lifting. The land on the far side hazy in brightness. and the current moving through it all. Steady. Unbroken. The fisherman finally spoke a few quiet words. Not urgent. Not instructional. Just something simple between them. The boy listened. Then nodded. The words were not important in themselves. Only the moment they belonged to. And as the sun continued its slow climb and the Nile carried on its endless movement through the land, the morning remained unbroken, flowing gently forward into the deeper warmth of the day. The river had begun to feel different now. Not in shape or direction. The Nile was still the Nile, wide, steady, familiar. But the light on it had changed again. Stronger now. More direct. The surface no longer held the soft silver of early morning or the gentle gold that followed. Instead, it reflected a clearer brightness, almost sharp in places, where the sun struck directly and turned the water into flickering lines of white and blue. Along the shore, shade became more valuable. People moved toward it without thinking. Not in a hurry. Just in quiet agreement with the day. A natural shift. A farmer stepped beneath a palm tree and rested his hands on the trunk for a moment. The bark felt warm. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again and looked back toward his fields. Work would continue. It always did. But the body needed pauses like this. Small ones. Enough to breathe. Enough to adjust. In the village, the rhythm of movement softened slightly but never stopped. The morning market had thinned, though it was not empty. Some baskets had been sold. Others remained half full under cloth covers to protect them from heat. A woman adjusted the shade cloth over dates again, making sure no direct sun touched them. A man rearranged clay jars so air could pass between them. A child sat beside a wall chewing a piece of bread slowly, no longer running, just resting in place. Even sound felt different now. Less scattered. More spaced out. Voices still existed, but they did not overlap as much. Each one seemed to float briefly before fading into the air. At the river landing, activity continued but with slower gestures. Workers still loaded and unloaded, but they took slightly longer between movements. Hands moved with care, not just for accuracy, but for comfort under heat. A rope was lifted, then adjusted. A basket was tilted, then set down more gently than before. Water was poured into a cup and held for a moment before drinking. The Nile breeze still reached them, but it carried more warmth now. Still helpful. Still present. Just changed. The fisherman's boat drifted closer to a shaded stretch near the reeds. He adjusted the oar once. Then let it rest. The fish basket sat half in shade, half in light. He looked at it briefly. Then looked at the river again. His son stood nearby on shore, now sitting instead of standing. Knees drawn slightly up. Hands resting on the ground behind him. He watched a line of ripples move outward from a passing bird. Then fade. Then disappear. The river always erased its own marks quickly. Everything moved on. Nothing stayed fixed for long. A cargo boat passed farther out, moving steadily north. Its sail hung heavy in the warmer air. Still moving. But with less lift from the breeze. The man at its bow leaned forward slightly, studying the water more carefully now. Heat changed how the river spoke. The patterns of light were different. The reflections sharper. The shadows beneath the surface more difficult to read. He kept his attention steady. The Nile required attention at all hours. On shore, women gathered linen that had finished drying. The cloth was warm to the touch. They folded it carefully and stacked it in woven baskets. One woman lifted a piece and checked it against the light. Then nodded. Another tied the bundle securely with flax cord. Nearby, a small child sat in shade playing with a piece of string. He tried to copy the knot his mother had just made. It slipped. He tried again. It held slightly longer. He smiled quietly to himself. No one corrected him. He was learning in his own time. In the fields, irrigation had slowed to a maintenance rhythm. Farmers no longer guided large flows of water. Instead, they checked channels already filled. Made small adjustments. Closed one opening. Opened another. A man stood knee-deep in a canal and watched water settle into a lower section of soil. He did not move for a long time. Just observing. Making sure nothing was wasted. The heat pressed gently now on shoulders and backs. Not heavy yet. But present. Constant. A reminder that midday was approaching. Farther along the riverbank, a heron lifted from shallow water and flew low across the surface. Its wings barely touched the air. It moved with practiced ease. Then landed again near a cluster of reeds farther downstream. The water there shimmered differently. Darker. Cooler beneath the surface. Fish moved beneath it in small flashes. The fisherman noticed. He always noticed. He lifted his net again. But slower now. More measured. The motion had changed slightly with the heat. Still steady. Still familiar. Just adjusted. The net fell into the water with a soft sound. Then sank. Then disappeared. He waited. The boat drifted a little sideways. A slight correction with the oar. Then stillness again. Waiting had become part of the work as much as catching. On shore, the boy leaned back further now. One hand in the sand tracing lines without thinking. A small curve. Then another. Then erased with the palm. He watched the river instead of his hands for a moment. The light on the water was strong enough now that he squinted slightly. But he did not move away. The river held him there. Quietly. The fisherman pulled the net again. Water poured through. This time fewer fish. But enough. Always enough. He placed them carefully into the basket. Then rested his hands for a moment on the oar. No disappointment. No change in mood. Only acceptance. The river gave what it gave. And the morning was not measured only by quantity. But by rhythm. By continuation. By the simple fact that everything was still moving forward. Across the landing, a man dipped a cloth into a water jar and wiped his face. The cloth came away warm. He exhaled slowly. Then sat down fully in the shade. For a moment he said nothing. Did nothing. Just existed in the pause. Beside him, another man watched boats on the river and spoke softly about the wind. Not a prediction. Not a concern. Just observation. The wind had shifted slightly. The sails showed it. The water showed it. The river always showed it. In the distance, another small boat rounded the bend. It was lighter than the cargo vessels. Likely a local craft. Perhaps carrying tools. Perhaps carrying people between nearby villages. Its movement was smooth but slower in the heat. It would arrive eventually. Nothing needed to rush. Nothing could rush the Nile. On the far bank, fields shimmered under stronger light. The green rose now carried a deeper contrast between shadow and sun. Farmers continued their work but more slowly spaced. Movements longer. Pauses more frequent. Water still flowed through channels, but carefully controlled now, like something being held gently rather than guided urgently. The village itself felt like it had shifted into a deeper part of the day. Not sleep, not rest, but a quieter version of work. Less motion at once, more stillness between tasks. And through it all, the river remained unchanged in presence. Only the light upon it moved. Only the heat of the air changed. Only the rhythm of human hands adjusted. The Nile continued, carrying boats, carrying reflections, carrying the slow, steady life along its banks into the fuller heat of the day. The heat of the day had now settled more fully over the Nile Valley. Not harsh yet, but steady. The kind of warmth that made still water feel deeper, and moving air feel rare and valuable when it passed. The river itself did not seem troubled by it. It continued as always, wide and patient, carrying light across its surface in broken, shifting lines. Boats moved more slowly now. Not from difficulty. Just from choice. From understanding. The fisherman's boat drifted near a cluster of reeds where the water was slightly cooler in color. He had shifted his position without speaking, letting the current guide him into a quieter stretch. The oar rested across the side of the boat. His hands were still. His eyes were not. He watched the surface closely. Not for anything dramatic. Only for the small signs that mattered here. A ripple that did not match the wind. A shadow that moved differently beneath the water. A brief flash that disappeared too quickly to be ignored. Beside him, the basket of fish was now half full. Covered partially with damp reeds to keep it cool. The boy on shore had moved again, now sitting in deeper shade near a low mud brick wall. He leaned back against it, feeling the warmth of the surface through his shoulders. His legs stretched out in front of him. One foot drew small shapes in dust. Then stopped. Then started again. He watched the river with a quieter gaze now. Less excitement. More steady attention. The kind that comes after long watching. Nearby, a woman passed carrying a bundle of dried herbs. The scent drifted lightly behind her. Sharp and green. She moved toward a shaded storage space where bundles were hung to preserve their dryness. Each bundle was tied carefully. Each one labeled in small marks only a few people could read. The scribe in the village had already begun working again, though slowly. He sat beneath shade with papyrus spread before him. His reed pen moved across the surface in short measured strokes. He paused often. Looked up. Listened to voices passing nearby. Then returned to the page. Records of grain. Deliveries. Boat arrivals. Small notes of daily life. Nothing urgent. Everything important. At the landing, one of the cargo boats had already begun preparing for departure again. Not fully loaded this time. Just enough for a short journey downstream. Workers checked ropes carefully. A man tightened a knot twice before stepping back. Another tested the balance of stacked baskets with a slow push of his hand. Everything held. Everything secure. The sail was raised only part way. Enough to catch the lighter wind that still moved along the river. The boat pushed away from shore gently. No sudden motion. Just release. Then drift. Then slow acceleration. The Nile accepted it as it always did. Nearby, another group of workers rested in shade, sitting on woven mats. They drank water slowly. One leaned his head back against a wooden post and closed his eyes. Another watched the river without speaking. Their work would resume later. When the heat eased. When movement felt easier again. For now, pause was part of the day. A farmer in the nearby field stood under a palm tree, wiping sweat from his face with the edge of his tunic. He looked out over the irrigation channels. The water still flowed, but more quietly now. Less urgency in its movement. More settled. He crouched and adjusted a small ridge of mud with his hands. Then stopped and watched. The water responded slowly. It always responded. The land here was never static. It shifted constantly with care and attention. And those who worked it learned to watch more than act. To adjust only when needed. A child nearby sat under shade with a small wooden stick, tracing the outline of a boat in the dust again. He had drawn it many times now. Each version slightly different. Sometimes larger. Sometimes with more sails. Sometimes with none at all. He erased and redrew without frustration. Only curiosity. A cat passed behind him and paused briefly before continuing on. Farther along the riverbank, a heron stood motionless again in shallow water. Its reflection was clearer now in the calmer midday surface. It did not move for a long time. Then, with a precise motion, it stepped forward and struck. A small ripple spread outward. Then settled again. The river quickly erased the moment. As it always did. At the village edge, women had shifted their work indoors or into deeper shade. The grinding stones were now quieter. Used in shorter bursts. Dough was being prepared for later baking rather than immediate cooking. Bread from earlier had already been distributed and eaten. Now the rhythm turned toward preparation for later hours. Not all work stopped. But it changed form. A slower cycle within the same day. A man carried a bundle of reeds into a shaded workshop where baskets were repaired. He placed them down and sat. Then immediately began weaving. His fingers moved without hesitation. The pattern already known. Already lived. A younger apprentice watched beside him, trying to match the rhythm. He paused often. Corrected himself. Then continued. The older man did not interrupt. Only observed. The lesson would settle in time. The sun had now reached a higher, more fixed position in the sky. The shadows beneath boats and trees were short and direct. The brightness on the water was stronger. Almost dazzling in places. Boats moving across it appeared briefly as silhouettes. Then returned to detail when they entered patches of shade from reeds or passing clouds. The fisherman finally lifted his net again. The movement slower now than earlier. More deliberate. He cast it into the water and waited. Longer this time. The river felt different in this hour. Not in hostility. Just in stillness. A deeper calm beneath the heat. He pulled the net back carefully. Fewer fish again. But steady. Consistent. Enough for the day's needs. He placed them into the basket and covered them. Then rested his hands on the side of the boat for a longer pause than before. The boy on shore shifted position again, now lying partly on his side in the shade. He still watched the river. But his gaze softened. Less focused on detail. More on motion as a whole. The rise and fall of boats. The shimmer of light. The slow bending of reeds. The constant but gentle flow of everything. In the distance, another boat appeared around a bend. Smaller. Light. Moving slowly along the edge of the current. Its sail barely filled. It would arrive eventually. Nothing here arrived quickly unless the river allowed it. And the river rarely rushed. As the boat approached, the fisherman lifted his head again. Not with urgency. Only awareness. Another arrival. Another moment in the long steady rhythm of the Nile. And as the day continued its slow movement forward beneath the strong midday sun, the river carried everything onward again, boats, people, light, and silence blending into a single unbroken flow of ordinary time. The afternoon light had begun to settle more firmly over the Nile Valley. The sun now stood higher, holding its position like a quiet weight above the land. Everything below it felt steady and warm. Not changing quickly anymore. Just existing in a long, even stretch of time. The river reflected that stillness in its own way. Its surface was brighter now, but also calmer in appearance. Fewer sharp ripples. More slow, wide movement. Like breathing that had lengthened and slowed. Along the bank, the fisherman's boat rested closer to the reeds. He had stopped casting the net for a time. Not because the river was empty, but because the rhythm of the day had shifted. He sat quietly, one hand resting on the side of the boat, the other loosely holding the oar. His posture was relaxed, but alert in a quiet way. The kind of alertness that never fully disappears near water. His son remained on shore, now fully in shade. He had stopped drawing in the dust and was simply watching again. This time not only the boat, but everything around it. The way light touched the water and disappeared. The way a reed bent and slowly returned upright. The way a small fish disturbed the surface for only a moment before vanishing again. He was no longer only seeing motion. He was beginning to see patterns. On the landing, activity continued in a slower rhythm. A group of workers unloaded the last of a cargo shipment that had arrived earlier. The baskets were lighter now. Mostly empty containers returning upstream. A man checked each one briefly before stacking them. Another tightened rope bindings that had loosened slightly in the heat. Everything was done with patience. No one hurried their hands. Nearby, a woman rested in shade while fanning herself with a woven palm leaf. Her movements were slow and repetitive. Not for cooling alone, but for comfort. For rhythm. Even rest had its own pattern here. A child lay curled beside her, half asleep. The heat had softened his energy. His breathing was slow. Even. Untroubled. At the edge of the village, a small group of farmers returned from the fields for a midday pause. Their clothes carried the scent of earth and sun. They walked slowly. Not speaking much. One carried a wooden tool over his shoulder. Another held a small pouch of water tightly in his hand. They entered shaded courtyards and lowered themselves onto woven mats. Silence came easily. Not awkward. Just natural. A place where effort no longer needed to be present for a while. In the fields behind them, irrigation channels continued to move water, but unattended for the moment. Not neglected. Just trusted. The land held its own balance for a short time. It always did. Farther along the river, a small boat passed carrying bundles of reeds and dried fish. The boatman leaned back slightly as he guided it with a long pole. His movements were slow and careful. The water here was slightly deeper, darker beneath the surface. He watched it closely. The Nile required attention even in rest. A single misjudged turn could bring the boat too close to reeds or shallow sand. But he had done this many times. His hands knew the distance before his eyes confirmed it. On shore, the fisherman's son had shifted again. Now sitting upright, knees drawn in, chin resting lightly on them. He watched his father's boat drift slightly with the current. Then correct itself. Then settle again. He noticed how little movement was needed to change direction. A small shift of weight. A slight pull of the oar. The river responded immediately. Not dramatically, but precisely. Nearby, a woman walked past carrying a shallow tray of dried grain. She moved slowly, careful not to spill. The grain shifted slightly with each step, making a soft rustling sound. She disappeared into a shaded building where storage baskets were kept. At the temple in the distance, the sound of activity had almost faded entirely. Only occasional footsteps echoed in stone corridors. A servant moved quietly through an open courtyard, adjusting a cloth over a carved altar. No ceremony was taking place now. Only maintenance, care, continuity. Even sacred spaces followed the rhythm of the day. At the river, a heron lifted suddenly from the far bank and crossed low over the water. Its wings barely disturbed the air. It moved with precise control, then disappeared into reeds again farther downstream. The river closed over its movement quickly, as if nothing had happened at all. But everything had changed slightly, as it always did. The fisherman finally stood in his boat. Not in preparation for departure. Only to stretch. His back straightened slowly. He exhaled. Then sat again. The basket beside him was now more than half full. Enough for drying. Enough for trade later. Enough for home. He glanced toward shore. His son was still watching. Still learning. Still quiet. The father did not call out. There was no need. Everything between them today had been spoken without words. At the landing, another boat approached. Smaller this time. Light enough to move easily even in the warm stillness of the afternoon. Its sail barely lifted. It drifted in with the current more than wind. Two figures were aboard. One guiding. One seated near the center holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. No urgency. Only travel. The river received it gently. The boat angled toward shore and slowed. A rope was prepared on land. Hands reached out. And the vessel settled into place as easily as the others before it. The fisherman watched this briefly. Then turned his gaze back to the water. The river never stopped bringing things. People. Goods. Movements. Moments. All arriving and leaving in the same steady flow. The sun began to shift slightly toward the west, though still high. A subtle change. Almost unnoticeable unless watched closely over time. Shadows began to angle just a little differently. The heat remained, but the intensity softened by a fraction. A sign that the day was slowly passing. Not ending. Just continuing forward. In a different phase. The boy on shore leaned back again and placed his hands behind him. He looked up briefly at the sky. Then back to the river. Everything felt wide. Open. Endless. The fisherman's boat rocked gently in place as a small wave passed beneath it. The sound of water tapping wood returned. Soft. Regular. Familiar. And as the afternoon settled deeper into its steady rhythm, the Nile continued to move through the land with quiet certainty, holding boats, fields, villages, and silence together in one long, unbroken flow of time. The afternoon had now deepened into a slower, heavier calm. Not uncomfortable. Just settled. The kind of warmth that made the world feel slightly softened at the edges, as if everything had been gently held in place for a long time without needing to change. The Nile moved through it without resistance. Its surface still carried light, but the brightness was less sharp now. More stretched out. More even. Boats on the river seemed to drift rather than travel. Even when they were moving with purpose, the pace blended into the wider stillness of the afternoon. The fisherman's boat stayed near the reeds. He had resumed his work, but in a lighter rhythm. Not continuous casting. Not constant motion. Just moments of action separated by long pauses. Net into water. Wait. Net out. Rest. His hands moved with familiarity, almost without effort. Each motion had been repeated so many times across years that it no longer felt like decision. Only habit. Only flow. His son remained on shore, now lying on his side with his head resting on his arm. His eyes were still open. Still watching. But slower now. Less sharp in focus. More open to everything at once. The movement of reeds. The shifting of light. The distant passing of boats. Even the sound of water itself seemed to hold his attention without needing to be understood. A woman nearby stepped carefully across the uneven bank carrying a bundle of reeds on her shoulder. She paused briefly to adjust her grip. Then continued walking toward a shaded workshop where baskets and mats were made. Inside, the air would be slightly cooler. Not much. But enough to continue work. Always enough to continue. At the landing, the earlier arrivals had mostly been sorted. Cargo stacked neatly under woven covers. Empty baskets returned to waiting piles. Ropes coiled and placed in order. A man sat on the edge of the platform dipping his feet into the water. He watched small ripples spread outward from his movement. Then disappear. Then repeat. Beside him, another man leaned against a wooden post and spoke quietly about the wind. It had shifted again slightly. Not enough to change the river's direction. But enough to be noticed in the sails. Everything here was noticed. Even the smallest change. In the fields, farmers had resumed work after their midday pause. Not with urgency. But with renewed steadiness. The soil was warmer now beneath their feet. The irrigation channels glimmered under stronger light. One farmer bent low and cleared debris from a water path. Another adjusted a mud ridge that had softened slightly under heat. Water flowed again into a new section of field. Slowly. Evenly. The plants stood still but alive in the heat. Their leaves angled slightly downward to hold less direct sun. They adapted without movement. Just as the people did. At the village edge, a group of children had gathered beneath a large palm tree where shade remained thickest. They sat in a loose circle drawing shapes in dust again. But now their movements were slower. Less playful. More quiet. One child traced a river shape. Another added small marks that might have been boats. Another erased everything and started again. No one argued. They simply observed each other's changes. A dog lay nearby, breathing slowly, eyes half closed. Even sleepiness seemed to settle into the scene. Not sleep itself. Just its presence nearby. At the temple, the stone corridors held cooler air than outside, but even there the warmth of the day had begun to seep in. Servants moved less often. Footsteps were spaced further apart. A priest sat in quiet reflection near a shaded pillar, hands resting on his knees. His gaze did not move much. Only occasionally shifting toward the open courtyard where light spilled in bright rectangles. The river could be seen faintly in the distance. A thin line of brightness beyond buildings and trees. Constant. Present. Unchanging in presence, even as everything around it shifted in light. Back at the boat, the fisherman lifted his net once more. The motion was slower now. More careful. The water received it without disturbance. He waited longer than before. Letting the river settle around the net completely. The boy on shore shifted slightly, turning onto his back. He looked up at the sky for a moment. The blue was still strong, but softened by heat haze near the horizon. He blinked slowly, then turned his gaze back toward the river. The fisherman pulled the net. Water streamed through in thin lines. A few fish flickered in the sunlight. Not many, but steady. Enough. He placed them in the basket and did not immediately reset the net. Instead, he paused. Longer than before. Resting his hands. Listening. The river made its own quiet sounds in this heat. Small shifts. Tiny movements beneath the surface. The kind of sound that did not ask to be noticed, but was always there if one stayed still long enough. A boat passed farther out on the river carrying stacked bundles of papyrus. The reeds were tied in thick bundles, their green fading slightly at the edges under the afternoon sun. The boat moved slowly, almost lazily. The man steering it used a long pole to keep distance from shallow areas. Each push against the riverbed sent the boat forward a little at a time. No rush. Just repetition. Push. Glide. Adjust. Push again. On shore, a woman sat beside a clay jar and dipped a cloth into water. She wrung it out slowly. Wiped her face. Then her hands. Then rested again. The jar beside her had warmed slightly in the sun, but the water inside remained cool enough to refresh. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Then opened them. And continued. The fisherman's son finally sat upright again. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. Then looked toward his father. The boat had not moved far. Only slightly repositioned by current and small adjustments. The father looked back for a moment. No words. Only a glance. Then returned his attention to the water. The boy stood slowly. Dust clinging to his legs. He stepped closer to the edge again but did not enter the water this time. He simply stood and watched. The river seemed even quieter now. Not in sound, but in feeling. As if the entire landscape had entered a long breath held gently in place. Even birds moved less often, perching longer between flights. Even wind felt more occasional, passing in brief, warm touches. And as the afternoon continued its slow, steady descent toward later hours, the Nile carried everything within it without effort: boats, people, silence, and light, all drifting together in a calm, unbroken current that never once needed to hurry. The afternoon had begun to soften again, not by becoming cooler, but by losing a little of its sharpness. The sun still stood high, still strong, but the light no longer felt as direct as before. It spread instead. Wider. Smoother. Like something slowly poured across the land and allowed to settle wherever it reached. On the Nile, this change showed first in the water. The surface no longer flashed as brightly in every direction. Some areas still caught the sun in sudden brightness, but between them were longer stretches of calm reflection. Reeds, boats, and sky appeared more clearly in those quieter patches. The fisherman's boat drifted slightly farther along the reed line. Not far. Only enough to follow where the current naturally carried him. He had resumed casting, but now with long pauses between each motion. His arms moved less often. His breathing matched the rhythm of waiting. Throw. Watch. Wait. Pull. The pattern had become something deeper than work. Something close to silence shaped into action. Inside the basket, the fish lay still, their bodies darkening slightly in the shade of woven reeds. The boy on shore had shifted again. Now he sat with his knees pulled up, chin resting on them. His eyes followed the faint movement of the boat as it adjusted itself with the water. He was no longer watching only for motion. He was watching for stillness between motions. For the spaces where nothing seemed to happen, but everything was still changing quietly underneath. A man passed behind him carrying a bundle of fishing lines coiled over his shoulder. He nodded once to the boy without stopping. The boy did not respond immediately. Only watched him go. At the landing, the earlier bustle had fully settled into maintenance. Not work that began or ended, but work that continued gently. A man tightened a rope that had loosened slightly as the sun dried it. Another checked the alignment of stacked baskets, making sure they would not fall if a breeze picked up. A third sat in shade and slowly repaired a tear in a woven mat, pulling reeds through in careful loops. Every action was small, precise, unhurried. Nearby, a woman rinsed clay cups and set them upside down on a wooden plank to dry. Water dripped from their rims in slow, even intervals. Drop. Pause. Drop. The sound blended into the wider quiet of the afternoon. Farther inland, farmers had entered what felt like the most stable part of their day. The work was neither heavy nor light. It simply existed. One man walked the length of an irrigation channel with his hand trailing lightly along the edge. He checked for weak spots in the mud ridge. Another adjusted a small opening where water was being redirected. Neither spoke much. They did not need to. The land itself communicated enough. Where water slowed. Where soil darkened. Where plants leaned slightly toward moisture. Everything was visible to those who knew how to see it. In the village, shade had become the center of movement. Not the edges. People gathered where walls blocked the sun or where trees offered wide shelter. A group of women sat together under a palm canopy sorting grain into smaller baskets. Their hands moved through the work slowly, almost rhythmically, as if the motion itself helped ease the heat. A child lay on his stomach nearby drawing circles in the dust with a stick. Then erasing them with his palm. Then drawing again. No urgency. Only repetition. A cat stretched out across warm stone and barely moved except for a slow flick of its tail. Even sound seemed reduced to essentials. Footsteps. Low conversation. Occasional laughter that did not last long but lingered in memory. At the temple, the stone floors held the last traces of earlier coolness. Now even that had softened. The air inside felt still, but not heavy. Just quiet in a deeper sense. A servant walked through a corridor carrying a small container of oil. He moved carefully so as not to spill it. The container reflected light in small flashes as he passed openings in the stone. A priest stood near a carved relief and traced the edge of it lightly with his fingers. Not reading. Not performing. Just observing the surface worn by time and touch. Outside the temple walls, the Nile could still be seen as a thin, bright band. Always present in the distance. Always moving. Never fully still. Back at the riverbank, the fisherman paused again. Longer this time. His net rested across the edge of the boat without being cast. His hands lay loosely in his lap. He looked out across the water without focusing on anything in particular. The boy on shore noticed this pause. He shifted slightly, leaning forward. But still did not speak. The pause felt important. Not empty. Just full in a different way. Around them, the river continued its quiet flow. A boat passed farther out carrying bundles of reeds tied with thin rope. The bundles were slightly uneven, suggesting they had been gathered quickly earlier in the day. The boat moved steadily, guided by a single man using a long pole. He did not look up much. His attention stayed close to the water's surface, reading it constantly, adjusting without hesitation. On the opposite bank, fields shimmered under the strong light. But even there, movement had slowed into its afternoon rhythm. Farmers walked less often between rows. Instead, they paused longer in place, checking conditions before acting. One man crouched beside a plant and gently pressed soil around its base. Then sat back on his heels and watched it for a moment. Then stood. And moved on. Everything was measured now. Nothing excessive. Nothing rushed. The sun shifted slightly lower than before, though still high enough to keep the land bright and warm. A subtle change. Almost invisible unless remembered from earlier. Shadows began to angle just slightly longer than they had been at peak. A sign of the day's slow turning. The fisherman finally reached forward and dipped the net once more into the water. The motion was softer than earlier casts. Almost gentle. He waited. Longer than usual. The river held the net without resistance. When he pulled it back, a few fish glimmered briefly in the light before being placed in the basket. Not many. But steady. Consistent. The boy on shore stood again. This time closer to the edge than before. But still not entering the water. He watched his father secure the catch. Watched the water fall from the net in thin streams. Watched how the river immediately smoothed itself again after disturbance. As if nothing had happened. But something always had. The fisherman tied the net loosely to the boat and rested again. This time both hands were still. The river around them continued its endless movement, but in this part of the afternoon it felt as though even the water had slowed its thoughts. And as the light stretched gently across the valley, the Nile carried everything forward once more, boats, people, heat, and silence blending together into a long, steady continuation of the same quiet day. The afternoon light had begun to soften again, but only slightly. Not yet evening. Not yet change. Just a quiet transition inside the same long hour of heat and stillness. The Nile reflected this gently. Its surface no longer shimmered with sharp brightness in every direction. Instead, the light spread out in calmer bands, as if the river was holding the sun's reflection more evenly now, less scattered, more settled. Along the reeds, small movements continued beneath the surface. Fish shifting. Water plants bending with the current. Tiny ripples forming and disappearing without sound. The fisherman's boat remained near the same stretch of water, drifting only as much as the current allowed. He had stopped casting for a time again. The net lay folded across the side of the boat, damp and heavy. His hands rested loosely. One near the rope. One on the wood. His posture was still, but not idle. It was the stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime learning when not to move. Beside him, the basket of fish was now fully shaded. The reeds covering it kept the contents cool, protecting them from the stronger light. His son stood on shore again, but now he had moved slightly closer to the water's edge. Not entering. Just near enough to feel the river's presence more clearly. The damp sand beneath his feet was cooler than the dry ground behind him. He shifted his weight slowly from one foot to the other. Watching. Always watching. A woman passed behind him carrying a shallow tray of clay bowls that had just been washed. She moved carefully to avoid uneven ground near the bank. The bowls clinked softly together with each step. A quiet, steady sound that disappeared quickly into the wider afternoon. At the landing, a small group of workers had begun preparing another boat for a short journey downstream. Not urgent. Not heavy cargo. just a few bundles and supplies wrapped tightly in cloth. They checked the ropes first. Always the ropes. Then the balance of weight inside the boat. One man pressed down gently on the edge to test stability. Another adjusted a bundle slightly to the left. Then nodded. Everything was ready. The sail hung loosely, waiting for wind that came in light, inconsistent patterns now. The boat would move, but slowly. As everything did at this hour. Nearby, a man sat on a wooden crate and carved a piece of wood with a small blade. His movements were careful and repetitive. Shavings fell in thin curls onto the ground. He paused often to look at the shape forming in his hands. Then continued without hurry. Across the riverbank, children had become quieter as well. Their earlier energy had softened into slower activity. Some lay in shade watching clouds move across the sky. Others traced lines in the dust without much intention. One child stacked small stones carefully, then watched them for a long moment before touching them again. Even play had slowed into something more reflective. In the fields, farmers continued their steady inspection of irrigation channels. Water still flowed, but more gently now through the warmer soil. One man walked along the edge of a canal with his hands clasped behind his back. He stopped frequently. Not because there was a problem, but because attention itself was part of the work. He watched the water enter a narrow channel. He watched how it spread into the earth. He nodded slightly, then moved on. Behind him, another farmer leaned against a hoe and looked toward the horizon. Heat shimmered above the fields. The air above the ground looked almost liquid in places. Still, the work continued. Always continuing. At the temple, the day had become even quieter. The stone corridors held a steady warmth now, no longer cool but not yet hot enough to disturb the calm. A servant moved slowly through an inner passage carrying a folded cloth. He set it down carefully in a storage niche. Then paused, as if checking whether anything else needed attention. Nothing did. So he remained still for a moment. Then turned and walked back. Outside, the faint line of the river was still visible beyond rooftops and trees. A steady reminder of time passing without sound. Back at the river, the fisherman finally shifted again. He reached for the net. Not quickly. Not decisively. Just with the ease of habit. He cast it into the water. The motion was smaller than earlier in the day. More controlled. More measured. He watched it settle beneath the surface. Then waited. Longer than before. The boy on shore stepped closer again, stopping just where damp sand met dry earth. He crouched slightly, resting his hands on his knees. His eyes followed the place where the net had disappeared. Waiting with his father. The river held the moment. No rush. No resistance. Just depth and silence beneath the surface. A small boat passed farther out again, carrying woven mats stacked neatly and tied with rope. The boat moved slowly, guided by a single figure using a long pole. The mats were light, but bulky, shifting slightly with each small change in wind. The boatman adjusted constantly, but gently. Always gently. Nothing needed force here. The Nile did most of the work. The fisherman pulled the net. Water streamed off in thin lines again. A few fish caught the afternoon light before being gathered into the basket. Not many. But enough. Always enough. He tied the net loosely and let it rest again across the boat. Then leaned back slightly, resting his shoulders. His son watched this pause closely. Not just the fishing, but the resting. The way work and stillness shared the same space. The river rippled softly nearby as a small breeze passed across the surface. Reeds bent together in one direction, then slowly returned upright. The movement was brief, but noticeable. The fisherman looked up toward the far bank for a moment, then back to the water. No change in expression, only awareness. The day was slowly continuing its path. Not toward ending yet, but toward a quieter form of itself. Across the village, the same shift could be felt. Fewer movements at once. More pauses between actions. More shade. More stillness. More observation. The Nile remained at the center of it all. Carrying boats. Carrying light. Carrying the long afternoon forward in a steady, unbroken flow that asked for nothing more than patience. The afternoon had settled into its deepest stretch now. Time itself felt slower here, as if the river had widened the day and made it more difficult for it to move quickly. The sun still held strong above the Nile Valley, but its presence was no longer sharp. It felt spread out. Even. Quietly constant. On the water, the reflections had grown softer again. Not dimmer. Just less intense. The river no longer flashed with sudden brightness. Instead, it carried light in long, steady bands that moved gently with every small ripple. The fisherman's boat drifted a little farther along the reed line. Not by effort. By habit and current together. He had stopped casting for a time again. The net remained folded, resting against the side of the boat. His hands were still. His gaze moved slowly across the water, never staying too long in one place. This was not waiting in the sense of impatience. It was waiting as a form of understanding. The river did not give continuously. It gave in its own quiet rhythm. His son remained near the shore, now sitting with his knees drawn close and his arms wrapped loosely around him. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the boat. But his attention was no longer only on his father. It had expanded. To the water. To the reeds. To the patterns forming and dissolving across the surface. To the way everything seemed to repeat, yet never exactly the same. A woman walked past behind him carrying a woven basket of dried fish. The smell was faint but distinct. She moved steadily toward the village center, where goods would be stored or traded later in the day. Her steps were slow but sure. There was no need for haste. Everything would reach its place in time. At the landing, activity had become sparse but not absent. A few boats remained tied loosely to the shore. Their ropes slackened in the heat. A man checked one knot, tightened it slightly, then stepped back into shade again. Another poured water from a clay jar into a smaller cup and drank slowly. Then passed it to a companion. No words were exchanged. Only the simple rhythm of sharing. Nearby, a group of workers sorted reeds that had arrived earlier. They separated long stalks from shorter ones. Straight from curved. Dry from slightly damp. Each type had its use. Each was placed in its own bundle. Their hands moved in quiet coordination, almost without instruction. In the fields, the farmers had reached a phase where movement was minimal but still essential. One man stood at the edge of a canal, watching water slip into a lower patch of soil. He did not interfere. Only observed. Then, after a long pause, he reached down and adjusted a small clump of earth with his fingers. A slight change. A careful correction. Then stillness again. His son sat nearby under a thin strip of shade, resting with a small bundle of seeds in his lap. He watched his father, then looked at the soil, then back again. Learning without words. In the village, even the soundscape had softened. Footsteps were fewer. Voices lower. Even animals seemed to move less frequently. A dog lay stretched beneath a cartwheel, breathing slowly. A cat remained perched on a wall, eyes half closed. Birds still moved, but in shorter bursts, landing more often than flying. The heat pressed gently over everything. Not harsh. Just constant. At the temple, the inner courtyard felt warmer than before, though still shaded enough to preserve calmness. A priest stood near a carved pillar, his hand resting lightly on the stone surface. He looked out through the open gate toward the distant river. It appeared as a thin bright line, almost trembling in the heat haze. He remained still for a long moment. Then turned and walked deeper into the temple. At the river, the fisherman finally lifted his net again. The motion was slower now than earlier in the day. More deliberate. Less frequent. He cast it into the water with practiced ease. It disappeared beneath the surface without sound. Then he waited. Longer than before. The boy on shore leaned forward slightly. His posture changed. More attentive. More focused. He watched the place where the net had gone under. The river seemed to hold its breath. Not in reality, but in feeling. As if even movement beneath the surface had slowed. A small boat passed farther out again. This one carrying empty baskets returning upstream. The boat rode slightly higher in the water now, lighter than before. The man steering it used a long pole with steady, minimal movements. Each push forward was followed by a long glide. Push. Glide. Rest. The rhythm mirrored everything else on the river at this hour. The fisherman pulled the net. Water streamed down in thin lines again. A few fish glimmered in the light. He placed them into the basket without hesitation. Not many. But steady. Reliable. Enough for the day's continuation. He tied the net loosely and let it rest again. Then leaned back slightly, letting his shoulders relax. The river around him shifted gently with a passing current. Reeds bent and slowly returned. A small ripple spread outward from somewhere unseen and disappeared just as quietly. The boy on shore finally stood again. Slowly. Carefully. He stepped a little closer to the edge, but not into the water this time. Just close enough to feel the dampness in the air rising from the river. He looked toward his father. Then toward the water. Then toward the landing farther downriver where boats came and went. Everything felt connected. Not explained. But understood in a quiet way. The fisherman noticed the boy standing. He did not speak. Only looked once. Then returned his attention to the water. No instruction. No interruption. Only presence. The afternoon continued its slow descent into a calmer tone. Shadows began to stretch slightly longer than before. Not enough to mark evening. But enough to suggest change was coming. A shift waiting quietly at the edge of the day. Across the river, fields shimmered in heat. Boats moved like dark shapes against the bright surface. The village remained steady. Breathing slowly. Working gently. Resting when needed. Returning to work when ready. And through it all, the Nile continued its endless motion, holding the day together in a long, quiet flow where nothing was rushed, nothing was wasted, and everything simply moved forward at the pace of water and light. The afternoon had begun to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward its later hours. The sun was still high, but its position no longer felt fixed in the same way it had been earlier. There was a quiet suggestion of movement now. A slow turning. a gradual easing from the strongest heat into something softer. The Nile reflected that change in the simplest way. Not through sudden difference, but through tone. The light on the water became less sharp in its brightness and more blended in its spread. Gold and pale blue no longer stood apart as clearly. They softened into each other, like colors resting instead of shining. The fisherman's boat drifted slightly away from the thickest reeds, following a subtle shift in current. He did not correct it immediately, only watched, letting the river carry him where it would for a moment. The net remained still, resting along the side of the boat. Damp, heavy, familiar. His hands lay loosely in his lap. No movement, just rest. His son on shore had changed position again. Now he stood, but not at the edge of the water. A little farther back in the shade, where the ground was dry and warm rather than damp. He watched the boat with a steadier gaze now. Less searching, more continuous. He no longer followed every small ripple. Instead, he watched the flow as a whole. The river as one movement rather than many pieces. A man passed behind him carrying a stack of thin wooden frames used for drying nets. The frames were tied together with rope and balanced carefully over his shoulder. He moved slowly toward a shaded storage area near the landing. At the landing itself, the rhythm of work had become even more spaced out. A boat that had been unloaded earlier now rocked gently in place, half empty. Its rope slackened. A man sat on its edge with one foot in the water, stirring small ripples with his heel. He watched them spread outward, then fade. Then did it again. Not in boredom, just in quiet observation. Nearby, another worker repaired a torn section of netting. His fingers moved through the weave carefully, pulling thread through damaged strands. Each knot was tied with deliberate attention. Each repair was a small restoration of something that would soon return to the river. Further inland, farmers had entered a calmer maintenance stage. One man walked slowly along a canal, occasionally stopping to check how water moved through narrow sections of soil. He no longer adjusted frequently, only when necessary. The rest of the time, he watched. The land was holding its balance. He only needed to confirm it. His son followed at a distance, carrying a small bundle of tools. The boy stopped more often than the man. Sometimes crouching to touch the earth. Sometimes simply watching water slip past his feet. In the village, shade had become the center of nearly all activity. A group of women gathered under a wide palm canopy, sorting grains into smaller containers for storage. Their hands moved less quickly now than in the morning. Not from fatigue, but from the softened pace of the day. A child leaned against one of the baskets and watched them work, occasionally picking up a grain and rolling it between his fingers before letting it fall again. Nearby, a cat moved slowly along a wall, pausing every few steps before continuing. Even its movements seemed stretched out, measured. The air itself felt thicker, not in weight, but in stillness. Sound carried differently. Voices reached less far. Footsteps felt softer. Everything seemed to exist slightly closer to the ground. At the temple, light had shifted again across the stone courtyard. The shadows of columns now stretched longer than before, marking the slow passage toward later afternoon. A priest moved through the space with a steady, unhurried pace. He paused at the edge of the courtyard and looked toward the river once more. The Nile was still visible beyond the village structures. A thin band of brightness, steady and unwavering. He stood there for a moment longer than before, then turned away. Inside the temple, the air remained calm. Still. Time there felt less divided into hours and more into presence. At the river, the fisherman finally reached for the net again. The motion was unhurried, almost gentle. He cast it into the water and watched it disappear beneath the surface. Then he waited. Longer than earlier casts. The river seemed to accept the net without disturbance, as if it had always been there. The boy on shore stepped forward slightly. Not to the edge. Just closer. His posture changed. More alert again. The pause between action and result felt longer now. He was beginning to notice that part. The waiting itself. Not just the catching. The fisherman pulled the net slowly. Water slid through it in thin, continuous streams. A few fish appeared briefly in the sunlight before being gathered into the basket. Not many. But steady. Predictable. Enough. He tied the net loosely and rested again. This pause felt longer than the previous ones. Not from exhaustion, but from rhythm. The river did not demand constant motion. It offered cycles. Action. Rest. Action. Rest. And everything beside it followed. A small boat passed in the distance carrying empty baskets upstream again. It moved more slowly now than earlier in the day. The man guiding it leaned on his pole for longer intervals between pushes. The current supported more of the movement now. The river doing more of the work as the day softened. On shore, the boy finally sat again. Not lying down this time. Just sitting upright. He looked at his father. Then at the water. Then at the far bank where light shimmered across fields and reeds. Everything felt connected again. Not through understanding, but through presence. The fisherman remained still in his boat. Watching the water. Listening to nothing in particular. Feeling the slow change in the air around him. The river carried a small ripple past the boat. It spread outward in soft circles. Then disappeared. As if it had never been there. And as the afternoon continued its gentle descent toward later light, the Nile held everything in its steady current, boats, people, fields, and silence all moving together in one long, quiet rhythm that never needed to speak in order to be understood. The afternoon had now settled into a long, unbroken calm. Not silence. Not stillness. But something between the two. A kind of quiet movement that continued without drawing attention to itself. The sun was still bright above the Nile Valley, but its intensity had softened again. Not weaker. Just more spread out. As if the light itself had grown tired of sharp edges and chosen instead to rest across everything evenly. On the river, reflections stretched longer now. Boats left faint trails behind them that lingered for a moment before dissolving. Reeds bent slowly and returned without urgency. Even ripples seemed to take their time before fading. The fisherman's boat remained close to the same stretch of water, though the current had shifted it slightly downstream. He did not resist that movement. Only adjusted when needed. The net lay quiet beside him. Damp. Still. A familiar weight. His hands rested on his knees now. Fingers loosely curled. He was not watching for catches in this moment. He was simply watching the river itself. The boy on shore had changed position again. Now he stood beneath deeper shade, where the palm leaves overhead filtered the sunlight into broken patterns on the ground. Light moved across his face in slow shifts as the leaves above swayed gently. He did not move much. Only his eyes followed the water. Occasionally he blinked slowly, as if matching the rhythm of the river without realizing it. A man passed behind him carrying a bundle of fishing nets draped over one arm. The nets hung in uneven loops, drying in the warm air. He walked toward a shaded rack near the landing where repaired nets were stored. At the landing, the activity had become almost purely maintenance. A few boats remained tied loosely, rocking gently with passing currents. One man checked rope tension with a slow pull, then released it again. Another sat on the edge of a platform, watching the water without expression, as if listening to something that could not be heard. Nearby, a woman rinsed baskets that had held grain earlier in the day. She dipped them in the river, lifted them, and let the water drain in long threads back into the Nile. Each motion was slow, repetitive, calm. Farther inland, farmers had nearly completed their midday adjustments. The fields now held a steady order. Water flowed through channels in controlled, even paths. One man walked along the edge of a field with a long wooden tool resting on his shoulder. He paused once, then again, checking nothing in particular, only confirming that everything remained as it should be. His son followed at a distance, carrying nothing now. Just walking. Just observing. Learning without instruction. In the village, shade had become deeper as the sun shifted slightly westward. The quality of light changed even under trees. It no longer fell in bright patches but in softer, longer shapes. People moved within it more slowly. A woman sat near a doorway peeling dried onions, letting the skins fall in thin curls beside her. A child nearby lay on his stomach, drawing lines in the dust with a stick, then pausing to watch them settle in the windless air. Even small sounds felt spaced apart. A distant hammer strike. A soft voice. The rustle of cloth. Each one separate. Each one fading before the next arrived. At the temple, the stone courtyard now held long diagonal shadows stretching across its floor. The light had shifted enough that even carved reliefs looked different than they had earlier. A priest walked slowly along the edge of the courtyard, his footsteps echoing faintly against stone. He paused again at the view toward the river. The Nile was still visible as a bright band in the distance, but now it seemed lower in the frame of the world. As if the day itself had risen above it. He stood there longer this time. Then turned away again. Inside, the temple remained cool compared to the outside air, but even that coolness had softened. Not lost. Just less distinct. Everything was blending gradually into the same temperature of day. Back at the river, the fisherman finally lifted his net again. The motion came more slowly than before. Not from fatigue, but from the rhythm of the afternoon itself. He cast it into the water. It disappeared beneath the surface without sound. Then he waited. Longer than any of the earlier pauses. The river seemed to deepen around that waiting. As if it understood the stillness and matched it. The boy on shore leaned forward slightly. His attention sharpened again. He watched the place where the net had gone under as if it might reveal something new each time. But nothing changed. Only time passed. Only water moved gently over the hidden shape beneath. A small boat drifted by farther out carrying bundles of papyrus reeds. The bundles were tied neatly, their ends uneven and frayed. The boat moved with minimal effort now, the current doing most of the work. The man steering it rested his pole against the side for a long moment before pushing again. Then resting again. Everything was slower. Everything more spaced out. The fisherman finally pulled the net. Water streamed down in steady, thin lines. A few fish flashed briefly in the afternoon light before being gathered into the basket. He did not look at them for long. Only placed them in. Then tied the net loosely again. And rested. The pause after this cast was longer than before. His shoulders lowered slightly. Not in tiredness, but in acceptance of the day's rhythm. The boy on shore stood once more. He did not come closer this time. He simply watched from where he was. Still. Quiet. The river moved around them both without interruption. Reeds bent with a passing ripple and slowly returned upright. A bird skimmed low over the surface and disappeared into the far bank reeds. The light shifted slightly again, as if the day had taken another small step toward evening without announcing it. And the Nile continued its steady flow through the land, holding boats, people, silence, and light together in a long, unbroken rhythm that asked nothing more than to be followed. The afternoon had grown softer now, not in a sudden way, but through many small changes that had slowly gathered without notice. The sun was still above the Nile Valley, yet it no longer felt as heavy in its presence. Its light had begun to stretch instead of press, to spread instead of strike. The river responded in its own quiet manner. The surface, once bright with sharper reflections, now carried a more blended glow. Gold and pale blue mixed together in long, gentle patterns that drifted with the current and faded without urgency. Nothing on the water felt fixed anymore. Everything was in slow transition. The fisherman sat in his boat without moving for a while. His net lay folded beside him, resting as if it had always belonged there. His hands were quiet. His posture relaxed, but steady. He looked out over the water, not searching, not waiting in tension, but simply observing the river as it was in this moment of the day. Beside the shore, his son remained standing in a calm stillness. He no longer followed every movement with his eyes. Instead, his gaze rested on the river as a whole. The boats, the reeds, the shifting light, the slow changes that came and went without announcement. He had stopped trying to understand each part, and was beginning, in his quiet way, to feel the whole. A soft breeze passed over the water. Reeds leaned together and then slowly returned upright. A small ripple moved across the surface and dissolved without trace. Somewhere farther out, a boat continued its slow journey, barely disturbing the water as it passed. Its sail hung loose now, no longer filled with strength, but drifting gently with what little wind remained. Everything had softened into continuation. Not ending. Not beginning. Just ongoing life. On the bank, the fisherman finally shifted. He reached down and adjusted the net one last time, not for use, but for rest. Then placed his hand briefly on the edge of the boat. A simple touch. A quiet grounding. He looked toward his son. The boy looked back. No words passed between them. None were needed. Everything that had been observed through the day, the water, the waiting, the movement, the stillness, had already spoken in its own way. The fisherman turned his gaze once more to the river. And remained there. Still. Present. The boy slowly sat down again near the shore, letting the warm earth support him. His eyes stayed on the water for a long time without shifting. The river continued its slow movement past them both. Carrying light. Carrying silence. Carrying the memory of the entire day within its flow. Farther along the valley, villages began to shift gently toward the next rhythm of their lives. Not rest yet. Not night. But the beginning of release from the strongest part of the day. Voices grew softer. Movements fewer. Shadows longer. Everything preparing, without effort, for what would come next. The Nile remained unchanged in essence. It did not hurry. It did not pause. It simply continued. As it always had. And as it always would. Flowing past reeds and boats, fields and stone, people and silence, holding them all in a single unbroken path of water and time that stretched far beyond sight. The fisherman remained in his boat. The boy remained on shore. And the river moved between them both, quiet and endless, carrying the day forward until it slowly, gently, became part of the memory of the water itself.